She was kicked out of her $1 million penthouse in the middle of a Manhattan winter night. No money, no apology. 3 years later, she returns to the city in a sleek black limousine adorned with the diamond necklace that once belonged to the queen of the underworld, and stands beside the man whose name all of New York City speaks softly of. This is the story of a woman utterly destroyed, who then rebuilt herself into something more dangerous than any enemy could ever imagine. Watch to the end, like, and comment with the name of the city you're watching in. I want to know how far this story has come. The snow came down in silence the night Vivian Castellane left New York. Not the kind of silence that brings peace. The kind that settles over a city after something has been destroyed. After the screaming stops and all that's left is the wreckage and the cold. She remembered standing on the sidewalk outside the Mercer Tower with one suitcase, a split lip she hadn't told anyone about, and 17 missed calls from a publicist named Derek, who was already spinning the narrative. Irreconcilable differences. That was the phrase. Polished and bloodless. The way Adrian preferred everything in his life. She hadn't cried. She'd been too numb for that. The town car Adrian's assistant had arranged, not Adrian himself, his assistant, because even in the ending of their marriage, he couldn't be bothered to appear in person, idled at the curb with its hazard lights blinking orange against the snow. The driver didn't look at her. Nobody looked at her. 3 years of being the most photographed woman at every charity event in Manhattan, and in the span of one phone call from Adrian's attorney, she had become invisible. She got in the car. She didn't look back at the building. That was the first mistake she made, thinking that not looking back meant she had survived it. The divorce had been coming for longer than Vivian admitted to herself. Even now, she could trace the exact moment it started unraveling if she let herself. A Tuesday in October, 2 years into the marriage, when she'd come home early from a fundraiser for a children's literacy nonprofit she'd spent 6 months building from nothing. The penthouse smelled different. A perfume she didn't recognize, something expensive and sharp, the kind of scent that announces itself like a statement. She'd stood in the hallway with her coat still on, keys in her hand, and listened to the particular silence of a space that had just been rearranged. She hadn't confronted him that night. She'd poured herself a glass of wine, sat on the terrace in 40-degree weather, and told herself she was imagining it. Then she'd done the same thing the next Tuesday, and the one after that. For 8 months, Vivian Castellane, once described in Vogue as a woman of extraordinary composure, practiced the art of not knowing what she already knew. The composure was real. She'd grown up learning it. Her father, Marcus Castellane, had been a man who moved through the world with the quiet authority of someone who understood where the real power lived. And it wasn't in boardrooms or courtrooms. It was in the spaces between words, in the things you didn't say and the information you didn't reveal. He taught her to read a room before she entered it, to listen more than she spoke, and to never, under any circumstances, let another person see the exact moment they'd hit a nerve. Marcus had died when Vivian was 26. Pancreatic cancer, fast and merciless, gone in 4 months from diagnosis to burial. She'd met Adrian at the funeral reception, which said everything about Adrian Mercer that she hadn't understood at the time. He was charming at grief. He knew exactly what to say, how long to hold your hand, when to laugh softly to break the tension. She'd mistaken that skill for empathy. It had taken her 3 years of marriage to understand it was simply another form of calculation. The night it finally broke open was a Thursday in late November. Vivian had known for weeks that something was coming to a head. The calls Adrian stepped out to take. The dinners where he looked at his phone more than her face. The way he'd started introducing her at events. Not cruelly, but with the particular negligence of a man who had mentally moved on and simply hadn't gotten around to informing the other party. She'd started gathering information the way her father had taught her, quietly, without tipping her hand. She'd read through calendars. She'd listened, she'd watched. She knew about Selena Merrow before she walked into that penthouse that Thursday night. What she hadn't anticipated was walking in to find them there, not at some hotel, not in some carefully maintained separation, but in her home. In the living room she'd spent 4 months decorating. On the couch she'd chosen herself from a place in Soho. Selena Merrow was 28, a socialite who had made a career out of proximity to powerful men, with a jaw-dropping face and the moral architecture of a toll booth. She didn't even look surprised when Vivian walked in. She looked almost bored, the way beautiful people sometimes look when they've been waiting too long for the inevitable scene. Adrian stood up. He didn't apologize. That was the thing Vivian turned over in her mind for months afterward, the thing that cut deepest. He didn't apologize because he didn't think he owed her one. He stood up, smoothed his jacket, and looked at her with the expression of a man who had been slightly inconvenienced. "Vivian," he said, just her name, like a period at the end of a sentence. She remembered her breathing going very still, the way her father's voice surfaced in her memory. "The moment they see you break is the moment you lose everything." She stood in the doorway of her own home with her coat still on, and she didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She looked at Adrian Mercer, and she said very quietly, "Get her out of my house." For a moment, he almost looked like he was going to comply. Then Selena uncrossed her legs slowly and leaned back into the cushions, and Adrian glanced at her. Just a glance, a half second. And that was all Vivian needed to understand the full geometry of what had happened. "We should talk," Adrian said, "but not tonight. You're telling me to leave my own home. I'm telling you the timing isn't great." He said it the way you'd tell someone their restaurant reservation got moved. Matter of fact, faintly apologetic in the tone, if not the substance. Something shifted in Vivian then. Not rage. Rage would have been cleaner. What shifted was something deeper, a tectonic thing, a slow, catastrophic rearrangement of everything she had built her sense of reality on for the past 3 years. She looked at Selena Merrow one more time. Selena met her gaze with the particular confidence of a woman who had already won. Vivian turned around and walked out. She made it 11 floors down in the elevator before her legs gave out. She sat on the marble floor of the 32nd floor corridor for 6 minutes. She counted. And then she got up, straightened her coat, and walked to the lobby. She never went back. The attorneys handled everything. That was the phrase they used. "We'll handle everything." As though the dissolution of a marriage was a logistical problem, something to be managed the way you'd manage a PR crisis or a difficult vendor. Vivian signed what they put in front of her. The prenuptial agreement was airtight and specifically designed to leave her with the minimum required by New York law, while Adrian retained everything of substance: the properties, the investments, the social infrastructure they'd built together. His attorneys had been working on the exit strategy for months. She understood that later. What she got was a settlement that looked generous in the headlines and amounted to enough money to disappear with. So she disappeared. She told herself it was strategic. She told herself she was following her father's principle. Retreat is not defeat. It's reconnaissance. She told herself a lot of things on the overnight flight to Palermo, sitting in business class with a glass of sparkling water she couldn't make herself drink, watching the lights of New York shrink through the oval window until they were just a blur of cold gold against black water. She didn't believe any of it. The truth was simpler and more humiliating. She ran because she didn't know what else to do. The woman of extraordinary composure had run out of composure. She ran because staying meant facing the full weight of what had happened. Not just the betrayal, but her own culpability in allowing herself to not know the things she'd known for 8 months. She ran because every person she encountered in New York carried a version of her story in their phone. And she couldn't walk into a room without feeling the shift in air pressure that meant people had just been discussing her. Sicily was her father's country. His family still had a property there, a farmhouse outside a small town in the interior, old stone and crumbling plaster and olive trees that had been there for centuries. She'd visited twice as a child. It was the kind of place that felt outside of time, removed from the machinery of the world she'd been living in. She booked a rental car and drove there from Palermo in the early morning, windows down, the smell of salt and stone filling the car, and for approximately 40 minutes, she felt something approaching peace. It didn't last. The first sign that something was wrong came 3 weeks into her stay. A car she didn't recognize had parked outside the property twice in the same week, a dark sedan with plates she couldn't read from the second-floor window. She told herself it was locals, curiosity about the American woman in the old Castellane house. But the car didn't move for hours, and the figure inside never got out. And Vivian had grown up around enough of her father's old associates to know the specific stillness of a person conducting surveillance. She called the one person in the world she trusted absolutely. Her father's oldest friend, a retired attorney named Enzo Ferrara, who lived in Palermo and had handled the Castellane family's Italian affairs for 40 years. Enzo came out the next morning, took one look at the situation, and told her to pack a bag. "You need to move," he said. He was a small, careful man with white hair and the kind of stillness that meant he had seen worse than this and knew exactly how quickly things could become irreversible. "Tonight." "What is this?" she asked. Enzo was quiet for a moment in the way she recognized. Her father had gone quiet the same way when something required more delicacy than speed. "Your ex-husband has a business associate named Costa. You may have met him." She had. Once, at a dinner in the Hamptons. A man with bad skin and excellent suits who had laughed too loud at everything Adrian said. "Costa has exposure in Sicily," Enzo said. "Old exposure, from before Adrian's time. There are people here who have been waiting for leverage on him. You are leverage." "I'm his ex-wife." "You are Marcus Castellane's daughter," Enzo said quietly. "That is a different thing entirely." She had never fully understood the scope of her father's history, the specific weight of his name in certain circles, the debts and favors and buried arrangements that persisted long after his death. She had known it existed the way you know an ocean exists when you're standing on a shoreline, aware of the depth without needing to measure it. Enzo's words dropped her into it. "So what do I do?" she said. "Tonight you move," he said. "Tomorrow we figure out the rest." The rest came fast. She was in a car heading toward a safe house Enzo had arranged, an old vineyard property in the hills east of the town. When the vehicle stopped moving, she heard voices outside, sharp and clipped, and then the door opened and a man she didn't know looked in at her with the specific blankness of someone following instructions. "You need to come with us," he said in Italian. It wasn't a request. The vineyard was abandoned, stone buildings with broken windows and weeds pushing through the courtyard stones. They put her in a room with a table and 2 chairs and a single light, and they told her to wait. She sat there for 3 hours listening to her own breathing, trying to inventory what she knew and what she didn't. She thought about her father. She thought about Adrian. She thought about all the ways she had arranged her life around the certainty of men who had known things she hadn't been allowed to know. Then the gunfire started. It came from outside the property, sharp, flat cracks that multiplied fast, the sound of a situation going from controlled to catastrophic in under 10 seconds. She heard men shouting, heard boots on the stone courtyard, heard the specific tonal shift of violence being conducted by professionals who knew exactly what they were doing. She got under the table, not heroic, not dignified, pure animal survival, and stayed there until the door to the room opened. The man who walked in was not Enzo. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, in a black coat that looked like it cost more than some cars she'd owned. Dark hair, sharp-jawed, and eyes the color of winter concrete. A gray so pale they looked almost colorless in the single overhead light. He looked at her under the table with an expression that contained neither surprise nor amusement. Just assessment. The way you look at a situation you need to understand before you commit to a decision. "Vivian Castellane," he said. Not a question. She didn't answer. "My name is Luca Deveraux," he said. "I knew your father. You're going to come with me now." She looked at him from under the table, calculating. Outside, the gunfire had stopped. The silence that replaced it was the kind she recognized now, aftermath silence. The silence of a thing concluded by force. "Why?" she said. Something moved in his face, not quite a smile, the shadow of one. "Because the men I just removed from this property have colleagues," he said, "and the colleagues will arrive within the hour." He extended one gloved hand toward her. "You can think about whether to trust me on the drive." She thought about it for approximately 4 seconds. Then she took his hand and got up off the floor. She didn't let go until she was in the SUV, the vineyard disappearing behind them in the darkness, and she realized her hand was shaking, not from fear exactly, from the accumulated weight of 3 weeks of trying to hold everything together alone, and the sudden presence of someone who seemed, for the first time in longer than she could account for, to actually know what they were doing. She pressed her hand flat against her knee and stared out the window. Luca Deveraux sat in the front passenger seat and didn't speak. That was the first night. That was the beginning of everything. But she learned who he was in pieces. Not from him. Luca was constitutionally opposed to explaining himself, she discovered, in the same way some buildings are constitutionally opposed to natural light. Information about him arrived sideways, through the behavior of the people around him. The way his men moved, not with the swagger of thugs, but with the precise economy of people who had been trained to a standard and held to it. The way phone calls were conducted in low voices and concluded without elaboration. The way every space he occupied seemed to calibrate around him, as though the room itself adjusted its posture when he walked in. Enzo, who had been located and was now at a safe house in Palermo, called her on the third day. His voice was carefully neutral, which she recognized as the tone he used when he was trying to give her information without alarming her. "You know who he is," Enzo said. "I'm getting a clearer picture," she said. "The Deveraux Syndicate controls the East Coast distribution ports, financial operations in 4 countries. He has arrangements with people in this government that I won't describe on a phone line." A pause. "He also has not, to my knowledge, ever hurt a woman. That is not nothing in his world." "Why did he come for me?" Another pause. "Your father did something for him once, a long time ago. I don't know the specifics. Marcus protected me from the specifics, but whatever it was significant." After she hung up, she sat with that for a long time. Her father had been many things she understood and some things she hadn't. He had moved through powerful circles with his particular quiet authority. He had known people she'd never been introduced to. He had, apparently, at some point done something significant for a man who now ran a criminal empire across the eastern seaboard. She had thought she knew her father. She was realizing she had known a version of him, the version he'd chosen to show her. The realization didn't make her angry. It made her feel the specific ache of someone who has lost a person and then keeps losing them in new ways as the full architecture of their life becomes clear. She found Luca in the main room of the safe house that evening. He was standing at the window with a phone in his hand, looking out at the dark Sicilian hills, and he turned when she came in with the unhurried attention of someone who had already registered her approach. "Tell me what my father did," she said. He studied her for a moment. "You don't waste time." "I've been wasting time for 3 years," she said. "I'm done with it." Something in his expression shifted. Not much, but enough. He set the phone down and turned to face her fully. "In 2009, Kisban," he said, "there was a situation that could have ended my family's operation permanently. A federal investigation built on testimony from a man inside our organization. The case was close to complete. Your father had a relationship with the U.S. attorney overseeing it. A legitimate relationship, business law, nothing improper. He used that relationship to learn the timeline. He gave us 72 hours to remove the problem." He paused. "I was 24. I had been running the operation for 8 months after my father died. Your father didn't know me. He had no obligation to help. He helped anyway." Vivian processed that. "Why?" "He said my father had been a fair man," Luca said simply. "He said fair men deserved a chance." She looked at him, really looked, past the surface of the black coat and the winter gray eyes and the particular stillness that the world had shaped around his authority. She saw something she hadn't expected to see. "And now you're returning a debt," she said. "I'm honoring a debt," he corrected her, with a precision she noted. "There's a difference." She thought about that distinction for a long time afterward. The weeks at the safe house stretched into months. There was a moment, she could identify it afterward, though she couldn't have named it while it was happening, when the arrangement shifted. When it stopped being a transaction, a debt being serviced, and became something else. It happened gradually, the way most significant changes happen, not in dramatic moments, but in accumulated small ones. Luca asking her one evening over dinner what she knew about Adrian's business dealings, not making conversation, genuinely wanting to understand. Her realizing partway through her answer that she knew more than she'd ever consciously cataloged. The way he listened, with the focused, specific attention of a man who was accustomed to information being the difference between survival and the alternative. "You were paying attention this whole time," he said. "I was raised to pay attention," she said. "But you let him convince you that you weren't worth listening to." The bluntness of it landed hard. She didn't look away from it. "Yes," she said. He nodded once, slowly, the way he acknowledged things that he considered important. "That's over now," he said. Not comfort, simply a fact, stated with the certainty of a decision made. She started learning things. Not formally. There were no lessons, no curriculum. But Luca existed in a world governed by specific rules, And those rules became available to her the same way language becomes available when you're immersed in it. Information networks, the architecture of leverage, how alliances were built and where they were most fragile, how to read the meaning in what wasn't said. She had the foundation from her father, the instincts, the patience, the capacity to absorb without revealing. And under Luca's operation, she watched those instincts find their full scale. She wasn't becoming him. She was becoming something he hadn't made her, something that had always existed inside her and simply hadn't had room to expand. He saw that clearly, she thought. Whatever else Luca Deveraux was, he was a man who understood the difference between making someone dependent and making someone capable. He treated those as entirely opposite outcomes. It was, she realized one night, the first time in her adult life, that a man with significant power had looked at her intelligence as an asset rather than a complication. They married 14 months after Sicily. It wasn't romantic in the conventional sense. There was no dramatic proposal, no moment suspended in cinematic light. He told her, over coffee in the kitchen of the Rome apartment where they'd been staying, that the legal and operational clarity of a marriage would benefit them both. She told him that if he was going to ask her to marry him, he could at least not make it sound like a corporate restructuring. He looked at her for a long moment. "I want you there," he said finally. Quietly, without qualification or performance. "Every room I'm in, every decision I make, I want you there." She held the directness of that for a moment. In Adrian's world, affection had always been a tool, something deployed to achieve a specific result. What Luca had just said was so stripped of strategy that it disoriented her slightly. "Okay," she said. They were married 3 weeks later, in a civil ceremony in a room with 6 witnesses, 2 of whom were Luca's attorneys and 1 of whom was Enzo, who cried quietly into a handkerchief and tried to make it look like allergies. That evening, in the apartment, Luca had stood at the window looking out over the city and said, without turning around, "Do you want to go back?" It wasn't a question. It was an offering. Vivian had stood there and thought about New York, about Adrian Mercer, somewhere in Manhattan, having breakfast with Selena Merrow, untouched, thriving, occupying the life she had vacated with the easy confidence of a man who expected the world to accommodate him. She thought about the woman who had sat on a marble corridor floor and counted to 6 minutes. "Yes," she said. Luca turned from the window. "Then we go back," he said. The night they returned to New York was the coldest December the city had seen in 11 years. The limousine moved through midtown traffic with the particular smoothness of a vehicle that had been fitted to insulate its occupants from the texture of the world outside. Vivian sat in the back seat in a black Valentino gown with a diamond necklace at her throat, a piece from the Deveraux collection, heavy and significant, the kind of jewelry that communicated information to people who knew what they were looking at. She watched the city move past the tinted window, the yellow blur of taxicabs, the vertical geometry of buildings she had left behind, the particular anonymous density of a place that contains Gates' millions of private lives in proximity and remains, at its core, indifferent to all of them. Luca sat beside her. He hadn't looked at his phone in the past 20 minutes. He was watching her, she realized. Not intrusively, not possessively, with the specific attentiveness of someone who was trying to understand what she was feeling so that he could be useful. "He'll be there," Luca said. "I know. How are you?" She considered the question. There was a version of herself that would have answered that with a performance. Fine, composed, untouchable. The composure her father had taught her weaponized into a shield she wore so consistently she sometimes forgot it was armor and not skin. "I'm angry," she said instead. Luca nodded. He didn't try to manage or redirect the anger. He simply acknowledged it the way you acknowledge weather, real and present, and something you move through rather than around. The limousine slowed. Outside, through the darkened glass, she could see the lights of the Valentino Royale, the building, the cameras, the crowd gathered at the entrance in the cold. She watched a woman in a red dress laugh at something her companion said. She watched a security guard check a list with the particular gravity of small authority exercised seriously. She breathed in, she breathed out. "Vivian," Luca said, and waited until she turned to look at him. He was watching her with the calm certainty of someone who had made their position clear and didn't need to repeat it. You're not walking back into what you left. You're walking back into something else entirely. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she picked up her clutch, and the driver opened the door, and the cold night air hit her face like a hand pressed flat against her skin. She stepped out. The cameras exploded. The crowd moved. And at the top of the gala staircase, 40 feet away, with a champagne flute frozen halfway to his lips and a face that had gone the particular gray of a man whose body has processed a shock before his mind has caught up, Adrian Mercer stood staring down at the woman he had discarded in the snow 3 years ago. Vivian looked up at him. She didn't smile. She didn't look away. Luca's gloved hand settled at the small of her back, not controlling, not guiding, present, solid, a fact. Adrian's champagne flute tilted, and someone nearby caught it before it fell. Vivian held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked away, as though he were simply furniture she had noted and moved past, and she walked toward the entrance of the gala with her spine straight and her pulse at 74 beats per minute. She counted, the way her father had taught her, because keeping count kept you present. And she didn't look back. Not once. What she didn't know as she walked through those doors was that Adrian Mercer had spent the past hour on his phone in a private booth near the gala's upper bar, talking to a man named Reardon. She didn't know about the 3 calls he'd made in the preceding week to 2 separate people whose relationship to Luca's organization was adversarial in ways that would only become clear later. She didn't know that the evening she had spent 3 years imagining, her return, her moment, was only the visible surface of something that had already been set into motion underground, in the dark places where the real machinery of the city operated. She didn't know any of that yet. She walked into the ballroom and the crowd parted, and somewhere behind her, outside in the cold, Adrian Mercer's hand was already reaching back for his phone. The ballroom of the Valentino Royale smelled like money and anxiety, the way all rooms full of powerful people do. Expensive perfume layered over the particular sweat of people who had too much to lose and knew it. Vivian walked in and felt the room adjust. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in films where the music stops and every head turns simultaneously. It was subtler than that, and more devastating. A ripple effect, table to table, the way information moves through a system that runs on information. A glance. A murmured word behind a raised glass. A slow pivot of a shoulder. Within 90 seconds of her entering the ballroom, every person who mattered knew she was there. She kept her pace even. Her father's voice in the back of her skull. Never rush, never hesitate, both communicate the same thing. That you're not sure you belong. Luca moved beside her. Not in front, not behind. Beside. She had noticed that about him early on, and it had taken her longer than she wanted to admit to understand what it meant. That in his world, where position communicated everything, choosing to stand level with someone was a specific statement. A senator from Connecticut materialized at their left, hand extended, face arranged in the careful warmth of a man who needed to be seen engaging with Luca Deveraux without appearing to need it too badly. Luca shook the hand with the minimal efficiency of someone completing a transaction and kept moving. The senator's smile stayed in place, but his eyes tracked them across the room with the expression of a man recalibrating. "Hargrove is sweating already," Luca said quietly, close enough that only she could hear. "He should be," Vivian said. "He voted against the port authorization in September. He thought you were finished." "He reads the wrong newspapers." "Most people do." A waitress appeared with champagne. Vivian took a glass and held it without drinking, scanning the room over the rim with the practiced nonchalance of someone who had spent years learning to look like they weren't looking. The ballroom was 3 tiers, the upper levels accessible by curved staircases at either end. The crowd was the specific composition of New York's upper echelon, the people who wrote checks large enough to appear at these events, and the people those people needed to keep happy, and the journalists and photographers allowed in to document the whole performance for the consumption of everyone outside it. She found Adrian before he found her. He was on the 2nd tier, near the bar, in conversation with 2 men she recognized as investors from his real estate portfolio. He was wearing a black tuxedo with a white pocket square, and he looked from this distance exactly the way he'd always looked. Composed, expensive, the kind of handsome that photographs well and communicates authority in a room. She had spent 3 years trying to deconstruct the spell of that appearance, and she felt a ghost of it now, faint and nauseating, the muscle memory of a response she had worked to dismantle. Then she looked more carefully and saw the things the distance had obscured. The set of his jaw, too tight. The way his right hand kept moving to his jacket pocket and stopping, reaching for a phone he was stopping himself from checking. The slight forward lean of a man who was trying to project ease and couldn't quite close the gap between projection and reality. He was rattled. Good. She looked away. The first hour of the gala was a performance she had given many times before in what felt like another life. Moving through the room, exchanging words with the right people in the right sequence, her hand briefly on an arm here, a laugh deployed with surgical precision there. The difference was the register of everything. 3 years ago, she had done this as Adrian Mercer's wife, which meant she was adjunct to his authority, reflected light. Now the conversations came to her differently. People wanted things from her, not socially, not the performance currency of inclusion in the right crowd. They wanted access. They wanted her to know they were aware of what she represented and that they had made their calculations, and their calculations came out in favor of Luca Deveraux. It should have felt good. It did feel good, which made her slightly uncomfortable with herself. She was talking to a woman named Catherine Hale, former federal prosecutor, now in private practice, a person whose exact institutional knowledge made her very useful to the right clients, when she felt the air in the room shift in a specific way. Not the ambient awareness of Luca nearby, something else, the specific pressure of eyes with intent behind them. She kept her focus on Catherine, finished her sentence, laughed at something the woman said about a mutual acquaintance, and only then, with the casual naturalness of someone glancing toward the bar, looked toward where the feeling was coming from. Adrian was watching her from 20 feet away. He wasn't pretending not to. He was just watching, glass in hand, with the specific naked quality of a man whose social mechanism had temporarily failed. No charm engaged, no performance layer, just the raw confrontational stare of someone who has been hit in a place they didn't think could still be hit. She held the eye contact for 1 beat. 2. Long enough to communicate that she saw him and was not reorganizing anything internally to accommodate the scene. Then she returned her attention to Catherine without rushing it. "I'm sorry," she said. "You were saying?" Catherine, who was not a woman who missed things, smiled faintly. "Nothing that can't wait," she said. "Enjoy your evening, Vivian." She found the marble balcony by instinct, the way you find air when a room becomes too dense. It was accessible through a pair of tall glass doors near the eastern staircase, a wide terrace that looked out over the city, the particular broken light view of Manhattan at night, all that vertical luminescence suspended over black water. The cold was immediate and clean, the kind that clarifies rather than numbs. She stood at the stone railing and breathed. The door opened behind her. She knew who it was before she turned around. She had known he would come. She had, if she was precise with herself, engineered the moment, chosen this location, this visibility, this moment of apparent solitude, because allowing the confrontation to happen on her terms was better than waiting for him to create the terms himself. Adrian Mercer stepped onto the balcony and let the door close behind him. Up close, the cracks in the performance were more visible. There was a tightness around his eyes that meant something was costing him more than he was showing, and his color was slightly off. Not pale exactly, more the gray-tinged quality of someone who had been sleeping badly for weeks. "You look well," he said. "I know," she said. He moved to the railing 6 feet from her and looked out at the city, which she recognized as his way of framing the conversation, establishing parallel position, avoiding the face-to-face geometry of confrontation. He had always done that, maneuvered the physical space to minimize the impact of things he didn't want to have impact. 3 years, he said. 14 months in Europe, 14 months in Rome primarily, sometime in Paris. 8 months since. She said it conversationally, the way you'd recite a travel itinerary. "Did you want the full accounting?" He looked at her. "You're enjoying this." "I'm standing on a balcony at a charity event in a city where I was born. The enjoying or not enjoying is still to be determined." "Don't do that." His voice tightened slightly. "The performance. You used to do it at every event and it was exhausting." She looked at him then with real attention. "I used to do it because you required it. You needed me calibrated at exactly the right level, visible enough to reflect well, quiet enough not to have opinions, It was a very specific performance, Adrian, and you wrote most of the script. His jaw moved. That's not... I'm not asking you to agree with it, she said. I'm not asking you for anything. I'm telling you what was true. He was quiet for a moment. Out over the city, a helicopter moved slowly north, its light blinking red against the dark. You think standing beside a criminal makes you powerful now? He said. The bitterness in it was the kind that had been aging somewhere for a long time. She heard the line and felt something. Not quite satisfaction, not quite pity. Something that had no clean name. The specific emotion of recognizing that a person you once loved has become smaller than the idea of them you've been carrying. No, she said quietly. I realized I was powerful the moment I stopped needing your approval. She watched the words land, watched him process them and find, apparently, that he didn't have an adequate response. His mouth opened, closed. He looked back out at the city with the expression of a man who has lost the thread of an argument and is stalling while he tries to locate it. Neither of them heard the door open. They both heard Luca speak. You should walk away now. His voice came from the doorway, low, unhurried, with the specific quality of a warning issued once to someone who is about to make an irreversible mistake. He stood in the frame of the glass door with one hand in his coat pocket and his eyes on Adrian with the focused, unblinking attention of something assessing threat. Adrian turned. In the 3 seconds that followed, Vivian watched him perform the rapid internal calculation of a man trying to determine whether the social rules of the environment he was in were sufficient protection. They were in a public space. There were 200 people 30 feet behind those glass doors. The calculus said he was safe. The calculus did not account for what was in Luca's eyes. We were having a conversation, Adrian said. He managed to make it sound almost steady. No, Luca said. He adjusted his cufflink with one hand, eyes never moving. She was tolerating your presence. That ended. A pause. Walk away before I mistake disrespect for a threat. Adrian's body went through something. She watched it happen. The involuntary physical response of a man who has encountered something his nervous system identifies as genuinely dangerous. The way your body knows certain things before your brain catches up. His shoulders shifted. His weight moved back an almost imperceptible quarter-inch. He looked at Vivian. She looked back at him without expression. He walked back through the glass door without another word. The door closed. The balcony was quiet. Luca came to stand beside her at the railing and looked out at the city and didn't say anything for almost a full minute, which was one of the things about him she had come to appreciate. He didn't fill silence the way insecure men do, didn't need to narrate his own actions or seek confirmation that they'd been observed correctly. He's not going to let this go, she said finally. No, Luca agreed. He'll try something. Yes. She looked at the lights. You already know what he's going to try. Luca was quiet for a moment. I have a general picture. She turned to look at him. He was still watching the city with the expression she had learned to read. Not blankness, which was what most people saw, but the specific intense quiet of a man doing significant internal processing at speed. Tell me, she said. He looked at her then. Not tonight. Luca. Not tonight, he said again, and the way he said it was not dismissal. It was the specific thing he did when information needed to be managed carefully, when the timing of what you know matters as much as the knowing. Tonight you walked back into this city, and every person in that room updated their understanding of where the ground is. Let that sit for tonight. She wanted to push. She recognized the want and made a decision about it. All right, she said. He nodded. After a moment, he offered his arm. She took it, and they went back inside. 3 weeks passed. In those 3 weeks, Vivian learned the city again from the inside out. Not the city she had known as Adrian's wife, the curated surface of charity galas and restaurant openings and weekends in the Hamptons. The actual city, the one that ran beneath the surface, the one governed by the specific invisible rules she had spent 2 years absorbing from Luca's operation in Europe. She met people. She listened. She attended 3 events where the purpose was not the event, but the specific conversations that happened at the margins of it. She sat in on 2 meetings in a building in Tribeca that functioned as a legitimate financial consulting firm from the outside and as something significantly more complex from the inside, and she said almost nothing during either meeting but understood by the end of both considerably more than she'd understood before. She also watched Adrian. Not directly. She was not a woman who made the mistake of direct surveillance when indirect was available. She tracked him through the information architecture Luca had taught her to use, the movement of capital through entities she knew were associated with his operation, the public record of his corporate filings, the pattern of his social appearances. She watched where he was and wasn't. She paid attention to who was seen with him and who was conspicuously not. On the 17th day, she noticed something. She was in the office on the top floor of the Deveraux building on Park Avenue, a room with floor-to-ceiling windows and a desk that was never quite tidy enough to be decorative and never quite chaotic enough to be dysfunctional. When she found it, not dramatically, not in the manner of a revelation with clean edges, she found it the way you find a structural flaw in a building, by knowing what you're looking for and being patient enough to look closely. A name. A company registered in Delaware 18 months ago, dormant until 6 weeks prior. A set of financial movements too regular to be coincidental, too carefully obscured to be legitimate. She pulled the thread. It led to another entity, this one offshore, registered through an attorney whose firm had a specific kind of client base. She pulled that thread. It led to a name she recognized. Not Adrian's. A name from Luca's world. Specifically from the portion of Luca's world that was not friendly. A man named Carver, who operated out of Boston and had been attempting to move into the New York infrastructure for 3 years with a consistent lack of success. She had heard Luca mention him twice, always briefly, always with the specific tone he used for problems that were managed but not resolved. She sat with it for 20 minutes, making sure she understood what she was looking at. Then she got up and found Luca. He was in the conference room with 2 men she knew. Reyes, his primary operations director, a compact, precise man who communicated almost entirely in understatement, and a security consultant named Deveraux, whose actual function was substantially broader than the title suggested. They were discussing something in low voices over a topographic map of the Brooklyn port infrastructure that Vivian recognized as a security review. She stood in the doorway until Luca looked up. She said, "I need 10 minutes." Reyes and Deveraux looked at her, then at Luca. Luca read something in her face and said, "Give us the room." They left without commentary. She came in and closed the door and put the documents she'd printed on the table in front of him. "Adrian has a relationship with Carver," she said. The room was very quiet. Luca looked at the documents. He didn't touch them immediately. He looked at them the way he looked at information that required him to recalibrate, carefully, with the specific attention of someone who is checking whether what they're seeing is what they think they're seeing. "How long have they been in contact?" he said. "The financial structure suggests 6 weeks. The relationship may predate it." "Where did you find this?" Delaware Registry cross-referenced with the offshore entity list from the Meyer filing. The attorney who set up the offshore structure has done work for Carver's operation in the past. He picked up the documents then and read through them. She watched his face. He gave almost nothing, but she had been watching his face for long enough to read the almost. The slight tightening around the mouth that meant the information was worse than manageable. The very still moment before he set the documents back down that meant he was making a series of decisions in sequence. "This is more developed than I thought," he said. "How much more?" He looked at her. "Carver has been trying to access our port arrangements for 3 years. If Adrian is giving him financial infrastructure to do it, and Adrian has federal exposure that he's trying to trade away," he stopped, started again. "If he's trying to build a federal case in exchange for protection from his own liability, he'd need evidence," she said. "Real evidence from inside your operation." "Yes." "Does he have access to that?" "He doesn't," Luca said, "but Carver might be building toward getting it. If Adrian is the financier and Carver provides the operational access, then they split the benefit," she said. "Adrian gets federal protection for his own exposure. Carver gets New York." Luca stood up. He moved to the window with the slow deliberateness of a man who is being careful not to move too fast because moving too fast when you're angry leads to decisions that cost more than the anger is worth. She waited. "You should have told me you were looking into this," he said finally. "Not angry, something more controlled than angry. I found it 3 hours ago. I mean, the broader surveillance, the tracking." She considered her response. "You told me not tonight," she said. "On the balcony. You told me to let it sit." I told you to let that evening sit. You were ambiguous, he turned from the window. I was not ambiguous. You were protecting me from information, she said, which is something I've had done to me before by men who thought they knew better. I decided to find my own. The temperature in the room did not change. The quality of the air did. Luca looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen directed at her before. Not anger, not coldness. Something more complicated. The expression of a man who has been confronted with the specific consequence of a thing he thought he'd left behind. That's not what I was doing, he said. Then what were you doing? I was trying to manage the pace of it, he said. You came back to the city 3 weeks ago. He stopped. A muscle in his jaw moved. I was trying to give you time. She heard it. She heard what was underneath it. Not condescension, not the management of a woman he thought couldn't handle the load. Something else entirely. The specific vulnerability of a man who had let something matter to him and was operating from the unfamiliar position of having something to lose. The realization moved through her quietly. I don't need time, she said, gently, firmly. I need to be in the room. He held her gaze for a long moment. I know, he said. I know that. He looked at the documents on the table. From now on, everything. Everything, she confirmed. He nodded once. Then he went to the door and called Reyes and Barrow back in. Bob. The next 10 days moved fast. Vivian was in every meeting. She sat beside Luca as they worked through the implications of what she'd found, built out the picture of what Adrian and Carver were constructing, identified the pressure points and the timeline. She contributed and was listened to, which was not something she performed gratitude about. It was simply the baseline she had established and intended to hold. She was also watching something she hadn't anticipated. The cost of what she'd set in motion by returning, not regret. She needed to be precise about that. It was not regret. But there was a weight to it she hadn't fully calculated in the clean theoretical version she'd carried through 3 years of rebuilding herself. In the theoretical version, the return was linear. Come back, be seen, watch Adrian reckon with what he'd thrown away. In the actual version, the return was a stone dropped into water, and the rings moved outward and touched things she hadn't intended to touch. There were people in Luca's organization who had been with him for years and who were now recalibrating their exposure because of Adrian's maneuver. There were arrangements in place, careful, specific arrangements between Luca's operation and the institutional infrastructure of the city that were now under pressure from the federal attention Adrian was attempting to court. People who had been comfortable were becoming uncomfortable, and some of that discomfort was landing, however indirectly, on her. She heard it first from a woman named Isabel, who handled the financial architecture of 3 of Luca's legitimate businesses. Isabel was 45, had the kind of mind that processed spreadsheets the way musicians process sound, and had been with the organization since before Vivian arrived. She was not unfriendly. She was not warm either. She existed in a careful middle register. She stopped Vivian in the hallway outside the offices one afternoon. I want you to know that what you found on Carver was significant, Isabel said. Precise. Factual. I also want you to know that several people here believe that the escalation with Mercer is a direct consequence of the return, that it could have been managed differently. Vivian looked at her. You mean I shouldn't have come back? I mean the timing created exposure, Isabel said. The question of whether it was worth it is above my pay grade. She walked away before Vivian could respond, which Vivian suspected was intentional. She stood in the hallway and held the conversation in her mind and separated the legitimate concern from the territorial anxiety, and the remainder, after that separation, was still something she needed to take seriously. She found Reyes that evening. Is there a consensus position in the building about me? She asked him directly. Reyes looked at her with the expression of a man who had not expected this question from this person at this time and was rapidly deciding how much accuracy was appropriate. He decided on considerable accuracy, which she appreciated. There's a range, he said. Some people have worked for Luca for a long time. They're loyal to him, and they trust his judgment on this. Others think the Mercer situation is a complication that didn't need to exist. Do they think I created it or that he created it? Reyes was quiet for a moment. Both, he said. Mercer would not have acted if you hadn't come back. You came back, therefore the action exists. That's the logic. That's also the logic that says women should stay home so men don't do stupid things, she said. The faintest edge of something appeared on Reyes's face. I know, he said. I'm not saying I agree with it. She nodded. Thank you for being straight with me. It's the only thing I know how to be, he said, and walked away. She was sitting in the office on the 23rd day since their return, building out a supplementary analysis of the Carver financial structure, when her phone buzzed with a message from a number she didn't recognize. The message was 4 words. You need to know. Below it, a location. An address in Tribeca. A restaurant she didn't know. She looked at the message for a long time. It was possible it was a provocation. It was possible it was a trap. It was possible it was one of Carver's people trying to draw her out of the security of the building. She ran through the risk architecture carefully. Then she thought about what Isabel had said, about the people in the building who had decided her return was the problem, about the logic of systems that protected themselves by limiting the information available to people who threatened the system's current shape. She looked at the message again. She made a decision. She didn't tell Luca. She told Marcus, not her father, who was dead, but the head of Luca's personal security detail, a man built like a piece of industrial architecture who had been assigned to her since their return without making a performance of it. She told Marcus she needed to go to a meeting and that it may be sensitive, and that she needed him and one other person and she needed it quiet. Marcus looked at her for a moment. Does he know? Not yet, she said. I need to understand what this is before I bring it in. He held the look for another moment. 2 people, he said. Car stays on the block. 30-minute window. That's enough, she said. The restaurant was small, expensive, and nearly empty at 4 in the afternoon. She sat at a table near the back and waited. Marcus and the second guard were outside in the car, which was not as comforting as she would have preferred, but was what she had committed to. The person who walked in 7 minutes later was not someone she had expected. It was Selena Marrow. She was thinner than 3 years ago. Still beautiful. It was a structural thing with Selena embedded in the geometry of her face, but with a quality of something spent about her, the way a room looks after it's been too bright for too long. She sat down across from Vivian without greeting and put a phone on the table face down between them. I almost didn't come, Selena said. Her voice was steady, but the steadiness had effort in it. What is this? Vivian said. Selena picked up the phone and turned it over. The screen showed a photograph, taken through a window, somewhat blurred, the kind of image produced by a long lens in low light. It showed 2 men sitting at a table. One was Adrian. The other was a man in a dark jacket whose face wasn't fully visible. The man on the right is a federal agent, Selena said. He's been meeting with Adrian for the past month. I know because Adrian used my apartment for the first 2 meetings before I understood what was happening. Vivian kept her voice level. What is he offering them? Evidence on Luca's operation, Selena said. He says he has financial documentation. He says it's enough. She paused. He's been building it for months. The whole reason he went to that gala was to communicate to Luca's associates that his situation was about to change. The specific cold clarity of a well-fitted piece of information dropping into place was something Vivian had felt before. She felt it now. She kept her breathing even and looked at Selena across the table. Why are you telling me this? She said. Selena looked at her for a moment with the expression of a woman who has been living with something that's gotten too heavy and has arrived, finally, at a place past calculation into the exhausted territory of something almost honest. Because he told me once that you were nothing, Selena said, after you left. He said you were soft, that you'd never amount to anything without him. Her voice didn't waver. Her eyes were very steady. I've spent 3 years watching what he does to people he calls nothing. The silence between them was very specific. I need everything, Vivian said. Every meeting, every name, every piece of documentation you've seen or heard about. I need it tonight. Selena reached into her bag and put a folded envelope on the table. I made copies 3 weeks ago, she said. When I was still deciding, Vivian picked up the envelope. She didn't open it at the table. You understand what this means for you, she said. Yes, Selena said. Adrian will know you were the source. I know. You'll need to disappear for a while. I know that too. Selena picked up her bag. She looked at Vivian with something that was not quite an apology and not quite a plea, something that existed in the space between those two things, the particular expression of a person who has done a thing they can't undo and has decided to live with it anyway. "I'm sorry," she said, "for the beginning, for being in your house." Vivian looked at her for a long moment. "Get somewhere safe tonight," she said. Selena left without looking back. Vivian sat at the table with the envelope in her hand and breathed, in and out, slow and even. She counted the breaths the way her father had taught her, because keeping count kept you present, and she needed to be present for what came next. She picked up her phone. She called Luca. He answered on the second ring. "I need you to come to a location in Tribeca," she said. "Now. And I need you to not be angry until after I've told you everything." A pause. "I'm never angry at you," he said. "You might be this time," she said. Another pause. Longer. "Send me the address," he said. She sent it. She put the phone down and looked at the envelope and understood, with the full weight of a person who has stopped lying to themselves, what was in it and what it meant and where the next 72 hours were going to go. The federal agent's meetings with Adrian hadn't started a month ago. According to the third page of documents she could see through the unsealed flap of the envelope, the first contact had been 6 weeks before the gala. 6 weeks before the gala, which meant it had been in motion before they ever arrived. Before the limousine, before the cameras, before the stairs. Adrian hadn't been rattled that night by their return. He had been waiting for them. The entire evening, the confrontation on the balcony, the fear she'd seen in his face, all of it had been a performance. And she had watched it and believed it and walked back inside thinking she had won. She sat very still with that understanding. Outside, through the restaurant window, the city moved past in its ordinary and different way. The cabs and pedestrians and the particular human density of a place that doesn't stop for anything. Somewhere in this city, Adrian Mercer was building a case that could dismantle everything Luca had spent 20 years constructing. And somewhere in this city, a federal operation was moving toward a timeline she didn't yet have. Her phone buzzed. Luca, a block away. She stood up, put the envelope in her coat, and walked toward the door. There was no version of the next 72 hours that didn't require her to be exactly what she had spent 3 years becoming. She pushed the door open and walked out into the cold. Luca came around the corner on foot, which surprised her. No car pulling up, no dramatic arrival, just him walking out of the pedestrian density of a Tribeca afternoon in his black coat, moving with the specific economy of a man who covered ground without appearing to hurry. Marcus, standing 10 feet from Vivian, clocked him at 50 meters and went very still in the way trained men go still when the person approaching is simultaneously the asset and the authority. Luca looked at Marcus first. One look. Marcus stepped back without being told. Then he looked at Vivian. She could see him reading her, the coat, the set of her shoulders, the envelope she was holding with both hands in front of her the way you hold something you haven't decided how to put down yet. His face gave almost nothing. His eyes gave a little more. "You're not hurt," he said. "No. But something is wrong." "Yes." He looked at the envelope. "Not out here," he said. They used a private room in the back of the restaurant. The owner, a compact Italian man in his 60s, took one look at Luca and produced the room without being asked, which told Vivian something about the geography of relationships she was still mapping. The room had a table, 4 chairs, a window that looked onto a service alley, and the particular quiet of a space designed to contain conversations that needed containing. Luca sat down. She put the envelope on the table and remained standing, because she needed the physical fact of being upright for what she was about to say. She told him everything. Selena coming to her, the photographs, the federal agent, the timeline. 6 weeks before the gala, before they'd ever boarded the plane back from Rome. She laid it out without editorializing, in the sequence she'd assembled it, because Luca processed information better in linear form, and she knew that about him and used it. When she finished, the room was very quiet. He was looking at the documents from the envelope, which he'd been reading while she talked. Not dismissively, she understood he could do both, absorb spoken information and visual information simultaneously when the situation required it. He turned the third page over and looked at the fourth. Then he set the stack down with the careful precision of a man being deliberate about not moving too fast. 6 weeks before the gala, he said. Yes. He was already in contact with the federal agent when we arrived. Yes. He looked up at her. You didn't tell me you were going to this meeting. No. Marcus told me you asked him not to. I told him I'd brief you after. I kept that. That's not the issue, and you know it. She held his gaze. I know. I made a judgment call. I'll stand behind it. Something moved in his face. It was not anger. She had expected anger and had prepared a response to it. What she saw was more complex than anger. It was the expression of a man recalibrating something fundamental, working through a scenario he had not built into his original architecture. The whole evening was theater, he said. Not a question. Working it through. Yes. He wanted us to see him rattled. He wanted us to feel like we had the position. He let me walk away from that balcony feeling like I'd won something, she said. The bitterness of it landed as she said it out loud for the first time. He needed us to settle in, feel secure, stop looking for what he was building. Luca was quiet. He picked up the fourth document again, looked at a specific line she couldn't see from where she stood, and set it back down. The financial documentation he's giving them, he said. If it's what this suggests, it's real, she said. It has to be real, or they wouldn't be this far along. Then he has a source. His voice was very controlled. Inside. She had arrived at that conclusion 40 minutes ago in the car and had been sitting with it since. Hearing him say it made it more concrete in a way she hadn't wanted it to become. Yes, she said. He stood up. He moved to the window that looked onto the alley and stood there with his back to her, hands in his coat pockets, and she watched his shoulders and understood that what she was seeing was a man doing something very difficult, containing a response large enough that not containing it would cost too much. She waited. He turned around. I need to make 2 calls, he said. Then we go back to the building, and I need you in every conversation from this point forward. No more separate operations. Agreed. I mean it, Vivian. So do I. He held her gaze for one more beat, then pulled out his phone. She sat down while he made the calls, low and brief in the other corner of the room, and she looked at the documents on the table and thought about a man who had been beaten by his wife's return and had found a way to reframe that as his first move. She had underestimated Adrian Mercer. She would not do it again. The building on Park Avenue that evening had a different quality to it. Not louder, if anything it was quieter, with the specific compressed energy of a space where people are moving with purpose and not wasting motion on performance. Reyes had assembled a core group by the time they arrived, 4 people who formed the inner architecture of Luca's operational decision-making, people who had been with the organization long enough to understand the difference between a problem and a crisis. Isabel was one of them. She looked at Vivian when she came in, and Vivian looked back at her, and something passed between them that was not warmth, but was a form of respect. The specific mutual recognition of 2 people who have each been right about different things and are now in the same room trying to solve the same problem. Luca laid it out with the economy of a man who did not believe in long explanations. Federal contact, timeline, source inside the organization. He said the last part once, clearly, and let it sit in the room and watched how people responded to it. Reyes went very still. Isabel's jaw tightened. The other 2, a man named Croft, who handled logistics, and a woman named Park, who was the organization's primary legal architecture, exchanged a look that was too fast for Vivian to read completely. How confident are we in the source assessment? Croft said. Confident enough to act on it, Luca said. Which means an internal review, Reyes said. He said it flatly, without inflection, because Reyes was a man who named things directly and let the room absorb the weight without his help. Yes, Luca said. The room absorbed it. I want the review structure designed tonight, Luca said. Park, you'll manage the legal exposure, Reyes, operational sequencing, Isabel, financial audit, everything from the last 6 months, every external contact logged or unlogged. He looked around the table. Nobody discusses this outside this room. Not with people they trust, not with people they've worked with for 20 years. Not with anyone. He didn't say because the person you trust might be the problem. He didn't need to. Vivian watched the room and did what she had been trained by years of her father's instruction and months of Luca's operation to do. She watched the people, not the problem. She watched what people did with their hands when they were told something difficult. She watched who looked at whom and who very carefully didn't. She watched the specific micro-expressions that moved across faces before the professional layer reasserted itself. She noted things. She didn't say them. Not yet. The next 4 days were the most exhausting of her life, and she had lived through a kidnapping in Sicily and a marriage to Adrian Mercer, so that was a meaningful comparison. She slept 4 hours a night in the apartment at the top of the Deveraux building, woke in the dark to the city lights through the window, and was in the office before 6 every morning. She built out the financial analysis alongside Isabel with the focused intensity of two people who had suspended personal friction in the face of a problem that required everything. She sat through interrogative conversations that weren't called interrogations but functioned as them. Careful, structured conversations with members of the staff conducted by Reyes with the specific gentle persistence of a man who is very good at making people feel comfortable enough to reveal the exact thing they'd planned not to. Nothing came from those conversations, which was itself information. It meant the source was either very good at this, or it was someone who hadn't been included in the interview process, and she sat with this possibility in the quiet hours of the early morning when the building was at its most honest. It was someone who was in the room. On the morning of the 5th day, Isabel found her. She came into the office where Vivian was working and closed the door behind her with the specific deliberateness of someone who has made a decision they can unmake and is getting it over with. She put a folder on the desk. She sat down across from Vivian. "I found something," she said. Vivian looked at the folder. "Tell me what I'm looking at." "A dormant account associated with one of our legitimate entities. It was set up 14 months ago with a secondary authorization signature." She paused. "The signature is Reyes." Vivian looked at her. "Show me." Isabel opened the folder and pointed to a line on the second page. Vivian looked at it. The signature was clear. She knew Reyes's handwriting from internal documents. She had been reading the operational paperwork of this organization for long enough to have a physical familiarity with how people wrote. It was his. She looked at the account movement history on the adjacent page. 14 months of inactivity. Then, 6 weeks before the gala, a series of small, structured withdrawals, the kind specifically sized to avoid automated flagging, the kind you learn to make if you understand financial surveillance. 6 weeks before the gala. The same timeline as Adrian's contact with the federal agent. She pressed her fingers flat against the desk and breathed very carefully. "Does Luca know?" she said. "No," Isabel said. "I found it an hour ago. I came to you first." "Why?" Isabel looked at her for a moment. "Because Reyes has been with Luca for 12 years, she said. "If I'm wrong, Luca hearing this from me without adequate preparation would be catastrophic for my standing here and possibly my physical safety. You have the relationship to manage the delivery." Vivian looked at her. It was honest. It was also the correct assessment. "I need 2 hours to verify independently," she said. "Then we take it to him together." "Agreed," Isabel said. She left the folder and walked out. Vivian sat alone with the documents for a long moment. She thought about Reyes, the precision of him, the specific quality of his loyalty, the way he had looked at her when she'd asked him directly about the internal consensus regarding her presence. He had been straight with her. That was what he'd said. "It's the only thing I know how to be." She thought about the specific irony of a man who had said that to her face while potentially feeding information to the federal operation that was trying to destroy everything around her. She thought about the possibility that she was wrong, that the documentation was wrong, planted, or misread. She spent 2 hours pulling every thread she could independently access. She checked the secondary authorization process for the account type, confirmed that only one person's credentials matched the signature authority for that specific entity class. She cross-referenced the withdrawal timeline with the operational calendar for the organization during that period, looking for events or access points that would have given someone the specific financial data that had ended up in the federal documentation Selena had provided. Every thread she pulled led to the same place. She picked up the phone. "I need you and Isabel in the conference room," she said when Luca answered. A pause. He read something in her voice. "5 minutes," he said. She had imagined this moment with other variables in it. She had imagined confronting an enemy, finding evidence on Adrian, closing the architecture of the threat from the outside in. She had not imagined sitting in a conference room watching Luca Deveraux look at a folder that implicated the man who had been closest to him for 12 years. He read through the documents without speaking. His face was very still. Isabel sat to Vivian's left and kept her gaze on the table with the deliberate neutrality of someone who understood they were in the vicinity of something enormous and needed to be as small as possible. When Luca finished reading, he closed the folder. He set his hands flat on the table. He looked at the middle distance for a moment, not at either of them, not at the door, at some interior geography that neither of them had access to. Then he said, "Get Reyes." Vivian looked at him. "Luca, get Reyes," he said again. The same volume, the same flatness. Not rage, something colder than rage, something that had gotten past the temperature of emotion into a place beyond it. She got up and found Reyes in the outer office, told him Luca needed him, and watched him come to the door of the conference room with the unhurried confidence of a man who had no reason to expect the specific thing that was waiting for him. Reyes walked in. He saw the folder on the table. He looked at it for one full second, and that second was long enough. Not because his face broke open, not because he ran, not because he did any of the dramatic things. It was long enough because of what he didn't do. He didn't ask what they were looking at. He didn't say what's going on. He looked at the folder and he went very still, and in that stillness was the shape of someone who has been found. Luca looked at him. "Sit down," Luca said. Reyes sat down. What followed was the most horrible conversation Vivian had ever witnessed, and she had witnessed the end of her own marriage. It was horrible not because it was violent. It was horrible because of how quiet it was. Luca asked questions and Reyes answered them in the voice of a man who had decided, somewhere in the instant between walking through the door and sitting down, that denial was not viable, and that what remained was a specific kind of honesty that was its own form of damage control. Yes. He had been contacted 8 months ago by an intermediary with a connection to federal authorities. Not Carver's people. Separate. A different thread in the same net. They had come to him with existing documentation and told him they had enough to end the operation and everyone in it, including him. They had offered him a path out in exchange for supplementary information. He had taken 3 months to decide. Then he had taken it. Vivian sat in that room and listened and felt the specific cold of a world reorganizing around a fact she couldn't unknow. She watched Luca's face and saw nothing she could read. That was its own form of information. "The gala," Luca said. His voice was level. "You knew the timeline." "Yes." "You knew what Adrian was building." "I knew some of it." "Did you tell them we were coming back?" A pause. "They already knew," Reyes said. "The gala appearance was being tracked. I confirmed the timeline of return." "Did you tell them about Sicily, about Vivian finding the Carver connection?" The pause this time was longer. "I told them someone inside had located the financial structure. I didn't specify who." Luca nodded. One small, controlled nod. "How long do we have?" Reyes looked at him. For the first time in the conversation, something in his face moved, something that looked almost like the ghost of the loyalty it was replacing, a faint residual expression of a man who had not found it easy to become what he'd become. "The filing is built," he said. "They're waiting for one more piece of documentation. When they get it, they move within 48 hours. "What's the piece?" "Financial records from the Hudson account, the primary one." Vivian looked at Isabel. Isabel was already on her phone. "How are they getting it?" Luca said. "There's a scheduled audit of the legitimate entities next week," Reyes said. "Planted inside the audit request is a secondary disclosure obligation that would expose the primary account. If the audit proceeds, it won't," Isabel said, phone still at her ear, already making the call to freeze it. The room was very quiet for a moment. Luca looked at Reyes for a long time. Long enough that Reyes looked down at the table. Not ashamed exactly. More the specific posture of a man waiting for a verdict. "Leave the building," Luca said. "Leave the city tonight. I'm not going to tell you where to go. Don't contact me. Don't contact anyone here. If you do, the conversation we have next will be different from this one." Reyes stood up. He looked at Luca one more time with the expression of a man trying to say something that doesn't have adequate language. "I'm sorry," he said. I know, Luca said. Reyes walked out. The door closed. Isabel excused herself quietly a moment later. Vivian let her go. She sat across from Luca in the conference room and looked at him and tried to find words that were adequate to the moment and concluded that there were none, so she didn't use any. She sat with him in the silence of a room where something had been broken that couldn't be repaired and let the silence be what it was. After a while, Luca said, I brought him into this operation when he was 26. He had nothing. His family was... He stopped. A muscle moved in his jaw. It doesn't matter. It matters to you, she said quietly. Yes, he said, which is exactly what they counted on. She reached across the table. She put her hand on his. Not comfort. She understood he wasn't a man who processed comfort in the conventional way, more the specific physical fact of presence. I'm here. This happened. We're still here. He looked at her hand and then looked at her face. The audit is stopped, he said, but the filing is built. They have everything except the Hudson documentation. So we have a window. A small one. Then we use it. He looked at her for a moment. Then he turned his hand over and held hers, briefly, with the grip of a man who doesn't ask for things and has decided to accept what's offered. Yes, he said, we use it. But the window was 36 hours. In those 36 hours, Vivian understood what it meant to operate at the speed Luca's world required when the margin for error was zero. She understood it not abstractly but physically, in the tightness across her shoulders that didn't ease, in the way she stopped tasting food, in the particular hyper-clarity of a mind that has gone past exhaustion into something cleaner and colder on the other side. They dismantled the audit trigger. Isabel rebuilt 3 of the financial entity's disclosure structures in 18 hours, working with 2 attorneys under non-disclosure constraints so tight they were told only what they needed to execute each specific task. The Hudson account was restructured into a form that was legitimate on its face and removed from the reach of the secondary disclosure mechanism. Vivian handled the parallel operation. She went back to Selena's documentation, the photographs, the records of Adrian's meetings with the federal agent. She cross-referenced it with what Reyes had told them about the filing structure. She identified the specific gap in the federal case. The documentation they had was strong, but built on a financial architecture that was now being restructured in real time. If the case proceeded before the restructuring was complete, there was a viable path to exposure. If the case was delayed, even by 72 hours, the architecture would no longer match the documentation, and the case would be built on a foundation that no longer existed. She needed to delay it. She called Catherine Hale. The former federal prosecutor answered on the third ring with the specific, careful neutrality of a woman who understood that certain calls were more complicated than they appeared. I need to ask you something sensitive, Vivian said. I assumed, Catherine said. A filing is being prepared against Luca's operation. The documentation is strong, but built on a financial structure that is currently being legitimately restructured. If the filing proceeds in the next 48 hours, the restructuring won't be complete. If it's delayed 72 hours, the documentation won't match the current state of the entities. You want me to create a delay? I want you to tell me if there is a legitimate procedural mechanism that could create one. Catherine was quiet for a moment. What kind of filing are we talking about? Federal. Financial documentation as primary evidence. The filing mechanism I believe is being used is a sealed preliminary, which means there's a review period before it becomes actionable, Catherine said. Yes. A preliminary challenge on standing grounds filed during the review period could create a procedural delay of 48 to 72 hours while the challenge is assessed. A pause. If the grounds were well constructed, could you construct them? Another pause. This one longer. Vivian held the phone and breathed. Send me what you have, Catherine said finally. Vivian sent it. 20 minutes later, Catherine called back. The standing challenge is viable, she said. It won't stop the filing permanently, but it will create the window. That's all I need, Vivian said. Vivian, Catherine's voice changed slightly. The professional layer thinned. Be very careful. Whatever you're doing in that window, be very careful. I know, Vivian said. She hung up and went to find Luca. She found him in the top floor office, standing at the window looking out at the Hudson River. The city was doing what it always did, indifferent, relentless, pouring itself over the dark water in cold light. She stood beside him and looked at it with him, and let a moment pass before she told him about Catherine and the challenge and the window. He listened. He nodded once when she finished. 48 to 72 hours, he said. Yes. That's enough to complete the restructuring. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. You've been running a parallel operation this entire time, he said, not accusatory, almost wondering. You taught me to, she said. He looked at her then. I taught you to run operations, he said. I didn't teach you to run them without telling me. You had enough, she said. You had Reyes, you had the financial restructuring, you had everything the organization needed. I handled what was left. What was left was the federal exposure. Yes, and I handled it. She held his gaze. I'm telling you now, every step. If you think I overstepped, tell me. He held her gaze for a long, specific moment. You didn't overstep, he said, but from this point forward, together, she said. I know. He turned back to the window. The Hudson restructuring will be complete in 16 hours, he said. The challenge buys us 60. That leaves 44 hours after completion, where we're clean, but the case is still potentially actionable if they find another path. What other path do they have? Adrian, he said. If Adrian provides supplementary testimony, he won't, she said. Luca looked at her. She met his eyes. I need to handle Adrian directly, she said. Not publicly, not at a gala. Directly. He studied her face with the specific attentiveness of someone trying to determine whether the person in front of them has fully understood the weight of what they're proposing. What does that mean? He said. It means I need to sit across a table from him and explain his options in a way that makes the federal operation less appealing than the alternative. The alternative being survival, she said. Adrian Mercer is not a man willing to die for a principle. He entered this because he thought it was his safest path. I need to show him a safer one. And if he doesn't take it, she was quiet for a moment. The question required honesty, and she gave it. Then we have a problem that requires a different solution, she said. But I don't think it will come to that. Luca looked at her for a long time. She watched him move through the decision, the specific internal architecture of a man weighing risk against trust, calculating exposure against capability, and arriving, at the end of it, at a place that surprised her slightly. Tell me what you need, he said. She told him. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, You have 24 hours before the window closes. I know. If it goes wrong, it won't. Vivian. His voice was very quiet, very specific. The voice he used when something mattered past the operational calculus into the territory of things he rarely named directly. If it goes wrong, I need you to walk away. Whatever's happening in that room, you walk away. She looked at him. She understood what he was saying and what was beneath it, and she held both with the care they deserved. I'll come back, she said. He nodded. It wasn't agreement. It was acknowledgement. The specific difference between those two things was one she had learned from him. She turned toward the door. She had 24 hours and 4 phone calls to make, and a conversation with Adrian Mercer that would either close this or open something far worse. She got to the door. Vivian. She turned. He was still at the window, looking at her, with the expression she had learned most slowly and understood most fully, the one that existed entirely outside his operational register, the one that appeared only in moments like this, when the machinery stopped and what remained was simply a man. I need you to come back, he said, not a request. A fact about what he needed, stated with the directness that was, she had come to understand, his specific form of vulnerability. He didn't ask for things. He stated their truth and trusted her with it. She held it for a moment. I know, she said. She walked out. The meeting with Adrian was set for the following morning. Vivian spent the night going over every variable, every contingency, every possible direction the conversation could move, and what she would do when it moved there. She sat at the desk in the apartment and wrote nothing down. Her father had taught her that the most important things are the ones you hold in your mind. because paper creates evidence and evidence creates exposure, and built the entire architecture of the conversation in her head, tested it against every version of Adrian she had known, and identified the specific pressure points. What she did not prepare for, what no preparation could have accommodated, was the call that came at 3 in the morning. The number on her phone was Marcus's. She answered immediately. "There's a problem," he said. She felt it before he said it. The specific cold of information incoming that will change everything. "What happened?" "The federal agent," Marcus said. His voice was contained, very controlled. "The one from Selena's photographs. He was found an hour ago in a car in Queens." A pause that lasted exactly long enough for her to understand the shape of what was coming. "He's dead." She stood up from the desk. Her hand tightened on the phone. "How?" "Staged as a suicide, professional work, but not quite professional enough." Another pause. "The preliminary on the scene is that it happened between 11 p.m. and midnight." She looked at the window, at the city out there, moving, indifferent. "Adrian," she said. "That's the current assessment," Marcus said. "Yes." She understood the implication instantly and completely. The federal agent was the primary contact in the case against Luca. With him dead, the case didn't disappear. Federal operations didn't die with their primary contacts, but it destabilized, created a leadership vacuum in the investigation, and most importantly, it created a new crime that needed to be solved. A federal agent dead in Queens was the kind of event that redirected institutional resources and attention in ways that were both unpredictable and enormous. Adrian had not gone to the federal operation to destroy Luca. He had used the federal operation as a tool and had now eliminated the tool because it had become a liability, which meant the 48-hour window she had calculated, the careful financial restructuring, the procedural challenge Catherine had filed, all of it was built on an understanding of the threat that was now fundamentally wrong. The threat was not a federal case. The threat was Adrian Mercer himself, who had just demonstrated that he was no longer playing by any rules she had anticipated and was now operating in territory where the only remaining logic was elimination. Her 24 hours, her conversation, her careful architecture of leverage and alternative, gone. She stood in the apartment at 3 in the morning with Marcus on the phone, and the city lit up cold outside the window, and understood that the person she had prepared to face tomorrow morning was not the person who existed tonight. The man she was going to meet was a man who had just killed a federal agent, and she had already told him where she was willing to sit across a table from him. She called Luca at 3:14 in the morning. He answered before the second ring, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either, which meant some part of him had been waiting for exactly this, not this specifically, but the shape of it, the particular hour and register of a call that means the situation has changed in a fundamental direction. "Marcus told you," he said. "Yes." "Where are you?" "The apartment." "Stay there." 2 words, flat and immediate. "Luca." "Vivian, stay there. I'm coming up." He was through the door in 4 minutes, still in the clothes he'd been wearing at midnight when she'd last seen him, which confirmed he hadn't slept. He looked at her face when he came in, and she watched him read it. Not the surface, not whether she was afraid, but the deeper register, whether she was intact, whether the specific thing that made her functional was still operational. It was a fast read. It always was. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said. "The meeting tomorrow is compromised," she said. "Adrian knows that killing the federal contact changes his exposure profile. He's no longer trying to build a case. He's trying to eliminate the case entirely, which means eliminating us." "Yes. He knows where I plan to meet him. I set that location through a third party, but Adrian has resources and he had time to identify it." "We're already moving on the location," Luca said. "Marcus flagged it the moment the agent's death came in." She looked at him. "You anticipated this." "I anticipated something," he said. "Not this specifically." She moved to the window. The city at 3 in the morning was as close to quiet as it ever got, which was not quiet. Only a different frequency of noise, the low continuous register of a place that never fully stopped. She pressed her fingers against the cold glass and thought. "He's not going to wait for a meeting," she said. "He staged a federal agent's death to look like a suicide. He's past the point of calculated moves. He's burning everything down and trying to walk away from the fire before it reaches him." "Yes," Luca said. "So the question is where he moves next and how fast." "He needs 2 things," Luca said. He came to stand beside her, not at the window, a step back, the way he positioned himself when he was thinking in 3 dimensions. He needs Selena contained. She's the only one who can directly testify to his contact with the federal agent, and he needs the financial documentation she gave you destroyed or discredited. Vivian turned from the window. Selena. We moved her 2 hours ago, Luca said. She's in a location only Marcus and I know. She breathed out, one small measure of relief in a room full of variables that didn't resolve. The documentation, she said. Copies in 3 locations, he said. None of them accessible to anyone outside this apartment. She looked at him. You've been 3 moves ahead this entire night. I've been trying to be, he said. It was the most honest thing he'd said, and it landed with the specific weight of a man admitting to the gap between effort and certainty. He was not infallible, and he knew it, and he was telling her he knew it. She nodded. So we go to him, she said. A pause. Explain. He's eliminating variables, she said, one by one, in the sequence that reduces his exposure. He killed the federal contact. He'll move on Selena next. Then the documentation. Then us. She held Luca's gaze. If we wait for him to complete that sequence, we're fighting on ground he chose. If we move first, we pick the ground, Luca said. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. She watched him think, the specific quality of his silence when he was working through something complex, a kind of density to it, the way an occupied room feels different from an empty one. He's at his estate in Westchester, he said. He moved there 3 days ago, reduced his Manhattan footprint. You've been tracking him. Since the gala. He said it without apology. I need 4 hours to position people. If we move at first light, what's the legal exposure? If it's done right, he said. None. She looked at him. Luca, what are you planning? He met her eyes. Adrian Mercer killed a federal agent, he said. The documentation Selena provided places him in contact with that agent. If that documentation reaches the right people in the right sequence, the federal investigation doesn't die with the agent. It redirects. On to Adrian. She processed this. You're going to give them Adrian. We're going to give them Adrian, he said, anonymously, through channels that create enough distance that the information appears to originate from within his own operation. That requires access to his system, she said. Internal documents, communications. Yes, and you have that. A pause. The specific pause of a man deciding how much to show. I've had partial access for 6 weeks, he said, since we identified the Carver connection. I didn't move on it earlier because I needed to understand the full scope before I acted. She held that. There was a version of herself that wanted to be angry about the information he'd been managing. She looked at that version and made a decision about it. What do you need from me? She said. The Selena documentation, formatted in a way that appears to originate internally, he said. You've seen how his organization files. You know his systems better than anyone here. You lived in his world for 3 years. She had. She had sat in his home office watching him work and absorbed the structure of it, the way you absorb the grammar of a language you're immersed in, the filing conventions, the email architecture, the specific way his team formatted internal communications. Give me 2 hours, she said. He nodded. He started to turn. Luca. She waited until he faced her. When this is done, she said, I want to be in the room when it closes. He looked at her for a long moment. I know, he said. She worked until 5:30 a.m. and produced documentation that would survive scrutiny. She had the eye for it, the specific attention to detail that came from years of absorbing a world whose surface was always different from its interior. She formatted the Selena materials inside an internal communication structure that matched Adrian's organization's conventions precisely, embedded it within a chain of correspondence that read as though it had been passed between 2 members of his own team who had grown nervous about their exposure, and attached supplementary financial documentation that Isabel had pulled overnight and that independently corroborated the federal contact timeline. When she was finished, she looked at it for 10 minutes, checking every detail and found nothing wrong. She sent it to Luca and went to the bathroom and put cold water on her face and looked at herself in the mirror. She looked like someone who hadn't slept. Her eyes had the particular brightness of a mind running too hot for too long, and her face had the gaunt quality of someone who had been burning through their reserves. She thought about the woman who had sat on a marble corridor floor and counted to 6 minutes. She thought about the envelope on the restaurant table. She thought about Reyes's face in that conference room. Not the betrayal, which was now a settled fact she'd moved past, but the moment before the professional layer reasserted itself. The ghost of loyalty in the expression of a man who had not found it easy to become what he'd become. She understood, standing in that bathroom at 5:30 in the morning, that nothing that had happened in the last 3 weeks had been clean, that the line between the kind of power she'd been building and the kind of power that had broken her before was not always visible and not always stable, that she had lied to people, maneuvered situations, used information as a weapon, and made decisions that other people would live with the consequences of without being consulted. She held that understanding. She didn't resolve it. It wasn't the kind of thing that resolved. She held it and acknowledged it and moved on, because the alternative was paralysis, and she did not have the luxury of paralysis. She went back to work. But at 6:45 a.m., the car left the building. Vivian sat in the back with Luca and a man named Torres, who was the person Marcus trusted with the things Marcus didn't do himself. Torres was built wide and moved with the specific controlled ease of someone for whom physical capability was a professional instrument rather than a personal characteristic. He didn't speak. He looked out the window with the focused calm of someone already operating. Marcus rode in the front passenger seat. There were 2 vehicles ahead and 1 behind. She knew the configuration without counting them because she had learned to read the shape of how Luca moved through the city. The Westchester drive was 45 minutes. They didn't speak for the first 20. The city gave way to the particular transitional landscape of the outer boroughs, the density thinning, the sky becoming visible in wider pieces, the specific quality of early morning light that hadn't yet decided whether it would be cold or something more neutral. The documentation went out at 5:52, Luca said. To the right people? 3 specific people within the federal system, the kind that don't bury things. A pause. They'll have it in their hands within the hour. The question is how fast it moves. It depends on how high the agent's death has already elevated the case, she said. If it's already an active situation internally, the documentation lands in the middle of it. It won't sit. No, he agreed. It won't sit. She looked out the window. What happens when we get there? Adrian will be made aware that the information has been provided to federal authorities, Luca said. That the case against my operation is now redirected at him. That the window for him to act on whatever he was planning closes in the time it takes law enforcement to process the documentation. You want him to know it was us? I want him to know it's over, Luca said. Specifically over, not ambiguously over. She understood. This was not just operational closure. This was something else. The specific thing that Luca almost never needed and was allowing himself to need now, which was for the person who had threatened everything he'd built to look him in the face and understand the precise nature of what had happened to him. There's risk in going there directly, she said. Yes. If he's as far gone as we think. Yes, he said again, still calm. I know the risk. She looked at him. I'm going in with you. He looked at her. She held the look and didn't move or qualify it. Yes, he said. Check. The Mercer estate was what money looked like when it was trying to communicate permanence. Stone gates, a half-mile drive lined with old trees, the house itself a large and deliberate thing set on high ground, with the Hudson Valley visible from its upper windows. She had been here twice during the marriage, for events she now remembered as performances she had attended on Adrian's behalf. The gates were closed when they arrived. One of the forward vehicles handled that. She didn't look. She kept her eyes on the house and breathed. They pulled up to the front at 7:22. The morning was gray and cold, the sky the particular white of a day that hasn't committed to anything yet. She got out of the car and felt the temperature immediately. The specific cold of elevated ground, wind moving through the old trees with a low continuous sound. Luca was beside her. Torres and 2 others were behind them. Marcus stayed with the vehicles. The front door opened before they reached it. The man who opened it was not Adrian. He was a security professional, the specific type, mid-40s, former military in the posture, if not the bearing, the kind of face that had made a career out of not showing what it was thinking. He looked at the group approaching and made a fast calculation. Mr. Mercer isn't expecting. He is now, Luca said. He didn't stop walking. The security man's hand moved to his jacket. Torres was beside him in one fluid step, hand on the man's wrist before the motion completed. Not violent, not yet, but with a specificity that communicated everything necessary about what the next moment would look like if the motion continued. The security man made his own calculation. He stepped back. They went inside. Adrian was in the study on the ground floor, which she knew from the sound of a television she recognized as financial news. The specific low urgency of morning business coverage. She knew this house's acoustics. She had stood in rooms in it and listened to the building the way she listened to everything. Luca opened the study door. Adrian was standing behind his desk. He had been standing, not sitting, which meant some part of him had already understood that something was coming. Some early warning system had fired and his body had responded before his mind caught up. He was in a gray sweater and dark trousers, his hair not yet arranged for the day, and he looked at them with the expression of a man who has had a long night, and whose morning has just become worse. His eyes went to Vivian. She held the look and gave him nothing. "You can't walk into my home," he said. His voice was steady. Impressive, actually, under the circumstances. She recognized the effort it took. "We just did," Luca said. He moved into the room and stopped in the center of it, hands in his coat pockets, looking at Adrian with the focused, unhurried attention she had seen him use in situations that required maximum clarity. "Sit down, Adrian. I'm calling. Your security is in the foyer having a conversation about his options," Luca said. "Your phone will reach federal authorities if you call it. That may interest you to know." A pause. "Sit down." Adrian sat. She watched him do it and watched what it cost him. The specific compressed fury of a man who is complying not because he has decided to, but because the variables have temporarily arranged themselves in a way that removes the alternative. Luca looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Your federal contact was found dead last night." Something moved across Adrian's face, a fast micro-expression. "Not surprise," she noted. "Not surprise." "I heard," Adrian said. "You heard," Luca said, "at 3 a.m. I have contacts who—" "You heard because you arranged it," Luca said, flat, without inflection. A statement of fact offered in the tone of a man who doesn't need agreement or denial to know what's true. "The case you built against my operation is now redirected. The documentation Selena Merrow provided, the records of your meetings, the financial structure connecting you to an active federal investigation and to a federal agent who is now dead, all of it was delivered to 3 specific federal contacts at 5:52 this morning." He paused. "They have it." Adrian's jaw tightened. His hands, flat on the desk, pressed down slightly harder. She watched his fingers and saw the white at the knuckles. "You think that protects you," Adrian said. His voice had changed. The steadiness was still there, but it had a different quality now. The steadiness of something compressed past its limit, a structure holding a load it wasn't designed to hold. "It doesn't need to protect me," Luca said. "My operation's exposure in whatever case was being built has been restructured out of their reach. What they have now is you." "You can't—" Adrian stopped, recalibrated. She watched him do it. The specific speed of an intelligent man reassessing in real time. "You fabricated documentation." "The documentation is Selena Merrow's," Luca said, "formatted internally within your organization's communication structure, which is something you might want to think about when you're deciding who inside your organization you trust." He tilted his head slightly. "That question is going to become important to you in the next several hours." Adrian's eyes moved to Vivian. She had been standing to Luca's right, slightly back, and she had let the conversation proceed without inserting herself because the conversation had been Luca's to conduct. But when Adrian looked at her, she moved forward. One step, enough to change the geometry, to make clear that she was not an observer. "This is your doing," Adrian said. Not yelling, something worse. The specific low intensity of a man who has identified the root of his problem and is looking directly at it. "All of it. You came back to this city, and you—" "I came back to this city," she said, "because it's mine." Her voice was even. She had prepared for this moment for 3 years without knowing she was preparing for it. And when it arrived, she found she didn't need any of the architecture she'd built. The words were simply true, and true things didn't require scaffolding. You made a calculation 3 years ago that I was finished, that I would disappear and stay disappeared. That was the last mistake you made about me. You think this ends here? He said. You think they're going to stop? There are people behind this that neither of you call. Carver, Luca said. Adrian stopped. Carver's operation is under a separate federal review that was initiated 8 months ago, Luca said. The port surveillance. His New York expansion triggered 3 separate monitoring flags. Whatever he promised you in exchange for the financial infrastructure you provided, he doesn't have the capacity to deliver it. He paused. You built a coalition with a man who is already burning. She watched Adrian absorb that. She watched the specific sequence of a man's operating assumptions being dismantled piece by piece and finding, at the end of the dismantling, that there is nothing underneath. He looked at his hands on the desk. The room was very quiet. Then he looked up and there was something in his face she had not expected. Not defeat, not fury, something rawer than both. The specific expression of a man who has arrived at the ground level of himself and doesn't recognize the terrain. What do you want? He said. The question was directed at her, not at Luca. At her. She held the moment. Nothing, she said. I don't want anything from you. I never did. You never understood that, and it's why everything that followed happened the way it did. She held his gaze and kept her voice level because level was what this required, and level was what she had. What happens next happens because you made choices, not because of me. Something moved in his face. She didn't name it. She didn't need to. She turned. She walked toward the door. Behind her, she heard Luca say quietly, "They'll be here within 2 hours. I'd suggest using the time constructively." She was in the hallway when she heard Adrian's voice, not directed at anyone, not a statement with an audience, just the specific sound of a man speaking into the air of a room where his story has just concluded. "I made you," he said. She stopped. She stood in the hallway with her hand not quite touching the wall, and she let the words exist for a moment. Then she kept walking. Outside, the morning had resolved into something. Gray, cold. The Hudson Valley stretched out below the property with the specific enduring quality of landscape that had been there before any of them and would be there after. She stood on the stone steps and breathed the cold air and felt the specific physical weight of the past 3 weeks as a presence in her body. The accumulated hours and the lost sleep and the specific cost of operating at the edge of your capacity for an extended time. Luca came out behind her. He stood beside her on the steps, and they looked at the valley together for a moment. "He'll cooperate," Luca said. "Yes," she said. "He doesn't have another move. The federal timeline will move fast now. The agent's death makes it a priority. Between the documentation and the Carver exposure, they'll have enough to— Luca." She turned to look at him. He stopped. "Not right now," she said quietly. "Give me 10 minutes where we don't talk about the next move." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. They stood on the steps in the cold, and she breathed and looked at the valley and felt, underneath the exhaustion, something she hadn't felt since she'd stepped off the plane at JFK. Not relief, not victory, not any of the clean emotions. Something more complicated and more true. The specific feeling of standing on ground that is yours because you fought for it, and the fighting has cost you things you won't fully account for until later. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A text from a number she'd recently added to her contacts. Catherine Hale. The challenge held. But something else came in this morning. You need to know about it. Call me. She looked at the message. She looked at the valley. She felt the 10 minutes she'd asked for contracting around the edges. "What is it?" Luca said. He hadn't looked at her phone. He'd read it in her posture. She showed him the message. He read it. He looked up. "Call her," he said. She pressed the number. Catherine picked up on the first ring, which meant she'd been waiting. She said 3 sentences. Short, specific. The kind of sentences that are short because expanding them would take time you might not have. Vivian listened. When the call ended, she lowered the phone and stood very still on the stone steps in the cold Westchester morning and looked at the ground in front of her feet and processed what she had just been told. Luca waited. She looked up at him. "The Carver operation," she said. "The federal monitoring. It didn't start 8 months ago." She held his eyes. It started 3 years ago. The initial target was your operation. Carver was secondary. She paused. The agent who was killed last night was not the primary contact on the case. He was a secondary handler. Another pause, each one buying her a half-second more to arrange the implications into something she could hand to him in one piece. The primary contact on the case has been active for 3 years. He's not federal. Who is he? Luca said. She had asked Catherine the same question, and Catherine had told her, and the name had landed the way certain names do. Not with surprise, because the body knows some things before the mind gets there, but with the specific catastrophic clarity of a thing that has been true for a long time and is only now visible. She told Luca the name. He went very still. She watched his face and saw something she had never seen there before. The specific moment when a man discovers that the architecture of his life contains a flaw so fundamental that everything built on it is now in question. It lasted less than 3 seconds. Then the professional layer reasserted, and what remained was the stillness she recognized. But underneath it, something had shifted, and the shift was permanent. "How long have they known about us?" he said. "Catherine estimates the full operational picture has been in their hands for 14 months, she said. "Since before Rome. Since before we came back." She held his gaze. "They've been waiting for us to surface." The cold morning air moved through the old trees with its low, continuous sound. Down in the valley, the Hudson moved the way rivers do. Indifferent, constant, not subject to the specific human disaster of people discovering that the ground they're standing on has been hollow for longer than they realized. Luca looked at her. She looked back at him. "Then we have a problem," he said, "that we cannot solve from the outside." "No," she said. "We can't." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was very controlled. "The name you just gave me. If that's accurate—" "Catherine doesn't give inaccurate information," Vivian said. "It's the only thing she has." "Then there is one move," he said. "One. And it has to happen before the federal timeline closes, and it has to happen in a way that creates enough institutional chaos to—" "I know what it is," she said. He looked at her. "You can't be the one to do it." "I'm the only one who can," she said. "Because I'm the only one who has direct access without triggering—" She stopped, recalibrated. "I know where he is. I have a reason to be in that room that doesn't require explanation. If you go, or anyone associated with the operation goes, it signals before we can close." "Vivian." "I know the risk," she said. "Do you?" His voice had changed. The operational register was almost gone. What was underneath it was the thing he rarely let surface. The thing she had come to understand was the actual Luca Deveraux, the one that existed below the 12 years of cultivated authority and the specific armor of a man who had learned very young what it cost to let things matter. "Do you understand what I'm telling you when I say you cannot?" "Yes," she said, quietly, firmly. "I understand everything you're telling me." She stepped toward him. She put her hand against his chest, felt the specific warmth of a living person under the layers of the black coat, felt his heartbeat, fast, faster than it appeared from the surface, the body's honest accounting of what the face wouldn't show. "I understand," she said again, "and I'm still the one who has to go." He looked at her for a long moment. His hand came up and covered hers. "You have 4 hours," he said. "After 4 hours, the federal documentation we released this morning will be in active processing. The window closes. 4 hours is enough. If it isn't, it will be," she said. She took her hand back. She stepped back. She looked at him one more time with everything she had, and everything she was, and everything that 3 years of becoming had produced. And she turned toward the car. "Tell Marcus to drive," she said. And Marcus drove, and the Westchester estate disappeared behind them, and the city appeared on the horizon like a promise or a threat, and Vivian Castellane looked at it through the window with 4 hours and one move and the full weight of every decision she had ever made riding in the car beside her. She did not look back. The name Catherine had given her was Daniel Hargrove, not the senator from Connecticut who had rushed to shake Luca's hand at the gala with his careful warmth and his recalibrating eyes. That Hargrove was the senator's older brother, a man who existed in no public record worth finding, who carried no title that appeared in any official directory, who had spent 22 years building a specific kind of institutional influence that operated entirely in the space between agencies, between jurisdictions, between the categories that oversight mechanisms were designed to monitor. Vivian had met him once. A dinner, 18 months into the marriage, at a restaurant in Midtown where the private rooms cost more than most people's monthly rent. Adrian had introduced him as a family friend. He had been unremarkable in the way that truly dangerous people sometimes are. Medium height, gray-templed, the kind of face that your memory smooths into a composite of other faces and loses its specific edges within hours. He had asked her about her father. She had answered politely and moved the conversation elsewhere. She had not thought about him again for 3 years. She thought about him now. She thought about what it meant that a man who had been in that dinner, who had sat across from Adrian Mercer and watched Vivian Castellane make polite conversation, had spent the subsequent 3 years building a federal case against the operation she was now at the center of. She thought about the timing. The case initiated 3 years ago, which was the same year she married Adrian, which was the same year her father had been dead for 18 months. And certain relationships her father had maintained had presumably become available to be recalibrated by people who understood their value. She thought about her father saying fair men deserved a chance, and Luca, at 24, being given 72 hours. She thought about what Hargrove might have known about that. The car moved south on the highway, and she built the architecture of the next 4 hours in her mind with the focused precision of someone who understands that precision is the only thing standing between a workable outcome and a catastrophic one. She had one asset Hargrove didn't know she had: the specific knowledge that he existed, that he was the primary contact, and that the federal operation was built around his architecture rather than the secondary handler who was now dead in Queens. Everything the operation could do was predicated on Hargrove's continued invisibility. The moment he became visible, the operation changed shape. She needed to make him visible. Not publicly, not yet, not in the way that created unpredictable institutional responses. Visible to the specific people who, once they understood what he'd built and how he'd built it, would have their own reasons to want it dismantled. The kind of visibility that travels through private channels and arrives as a problem that gets solved in the way problems of that nature get solved, quietly, internally, with no public record and a great deal of velocity. She called Isabel from the car. "I need everything we have on Daniel Hargrove," she said, specifically his relationship to the senator's office and any financial instruments connecting him to either the Carver operation or Adrian's entity structure. A pause. "How fast?" 2 hours. Another pause, longer, the sound of someone recalibrating their morning. "I'll call you back in 90 minutes, Isabel said, and hung up. She put the phone down. Marcus glanced at her in the rearview mirror. She met his eyes for a moment, and he looked back at the road. "Where are we going?" he said. She told him. The building she directed him to was in Midtown, a commercial tower on a block that looked entirely unremarkable because it had been designed to look entirely unremarkable. The specific aesthetic of institutional invisibility, the kind of building that exists in the peripheral vision of a city without ever drawing direct attention. She had driven past it dozens of times during the marriage without registering it. She had registered it 6 weeks ago when Isabel's financial audit had identified a recurring operational expense connected to an address that matched this building, an expense categorized as consulting services and paid through 3 layers of entity structure that resolved, at the bottom, to a firm that had Daniel Hargrove's signature on its founding documents. He was here regularly. Catherine had confirmed that. She was here now. She got out of the car and told Marcus to stay with it. He looked at her with the specific expression of a man whose professional obligation and personal judgment were pointing in opposite directions. "I need 30 minutes, she said. "If I'm not back in 45, call Luca." "You should be in the car," she said. "If you come inside with me, it signals. I need this to look like what it looks like. One person, no security, no operational weight." He held the look for a moment. Then he sat back. She walked to the building. The lobby was marble and glass with the quiet efficiency of a space that processed important people without making a performance of it. A security desk, 2 guards, a badge system. She went to the desk and gave the name she had prepared. Not her own, a name connected to a legitimate financial firm that did actual consulting work. A name she had researched enough to use with the specific confidence of someone who has been in rooms like this before and knows the exact register of ease that gets you through them. The guard made a call. She stood with her coat on and her hands still and her face arranged in the neutral patience of someone with an appointment, which she did not have, but patience projects the same way regardless of its foundation. The guard said, "Mr. Hargrove will be down in a few minutes." She thanked him and moved to the seating area and sat down and looked at her phone and felt her heart doing something complicated in her chest. Not fear exactly, though fear was present. More the specific physiological response of a body that knows it is in a situation where the margin for error is narrow enough to be, in practical terms, non-existent. She breathed, she counted, 4 in, 4 out, the way her father had taught her. Hargrove appeared from the elevator bank 8 minutes later. He was exactly as she remembered. Medium height, gray-templed, the face that didn't hold its shape in memory. He was wearing a suit that cost what good suits cost, and he was looking at his phone when he crossed the lobby, and he looked up when he registered her standing, and in the half-second before his professional layer fully engaged, she saw it, the specific micro-expression of recognition, not of her name or her face, but of the category. He knew she was not who she'd said she was. He knew in the first half-second, and what he chose to do with that knowledge in the subsequent seconds would determine everything. He chose to approach. That told her something. "Miss Castellane," he said. Not a question. The slight emphasis on the correct name, the acknowledgement that he knew, delivered with the specific calm of a man who is re-establishing the terms of the encounter. "Mr. Hargrove," she said. "My assistant said—" "Your assistant was given a name that got me through the lobby," she said. "I apologize for the mechanism, not for being here." He looked at her for a moment. Then he gestured toward the seating area. They sat down across from each other in the marble lobby of a building in Midtown, and she felt the specific absurdity and the specific gravity of it simultaneously. Two people having a conversation that was about everything and looked like nothing. "You're either very brave or very poorly advised," he said. "I'm neither," she said. "I'm accurate. There's a difference." He studied her face. Up close, he was more present than she remembered, sharper, with the specific alertness of someone who processed information at speed and had learned to look relaxed while doing it. "What do you want?" he said. She put a folder on the table between them. She did not open it. "The secondary handler is dead," she said. "You've been told this. You're managing the operational fallout this morning, which is why you came down instead of sending security to remove me." She held his gaze. "The case you've been building for 3 years is structurally sound, but it is now missing its primary corroborating witness, its lead documentation handler, and the financial architecture it was built on, which was restructured as of 6 this morning." His face gave nothing. His eyes gave a little. "You've had a busy night," he said. "I've had a busy month," she said. "The folder contains documentation of your personal financial relationship with a series of entities connected to Adrian Mercer's corporate structure, going back to the year the case was initiated." She paused. "I want you to understand what I'm telling you. I'm not telling you that I have evidence of wrongdoing. I'm telling you that the appearance of a personal financial relationship between the primary architect of a federal investigation and the man who subsequently became that investigation's primary informant would require a level of institutional explanation that would occupy a significant portion of your next several years." He was very still. "That's a significant claim," he said. "It's a documented one," she said. "The folder." He didn't look at it. He kept his eyes on her. She respected that. It was the right move, the move of a man who understood that information could be evaluated later and that the more pressing assessment was the person across from him. "What do you want?" he said again. "The case against Luca Deveraux's operation is closed," she said. "Not delayed, not restructured. Closed, with a formal internal determination that the evidentiary foundation has been compromised by the handler's death and the financial restructuring." She kept her voice level and her gaze direct. "In exchange, the contents of this folder remain private. You're asking me to kill a 3-year investigation. I'm asking you to acknowledge that it's already dead," she said. "The handler is gone. The informant is Adrian Mercer, who is currently the subject of a separate federal inquiry into the death of a federal agent. The financial structure the case was built on has been legitimately restructured. What you have left is a case file that, if it proceeds, will raise questions about how it was built that you cannot answer publicly without the kind of disclosure that ends careers." She paused. I'm offering you this quiet version. The lobby moved around them, people crossing, the distant sound of the elevators, the ordinary machinery of a building full of people who had no idea what was happening in this particular corner of it. Hargrove looked at the folder on the table. For the first time since he'd sat down, he looked at it rather than her. Your father, he said. She didn't respond. Marcus Castellane and I worked in adjacent spaces for a long time, he said. I had a great deal of respect for him. He said it without obvious sentiment, as a statement of operational fact. I want you to know that the case against Deveraux was not initiated because of your father. His history with that operation was something I was aware of and chose to manage quietly. She processed that. Meaning you had leverage and didn't use it. Meaning I had information and made a judgment, he said. Your father was a man who made complicated choices in complicated circumstances and lived with them with more integrity than most. He held her gaze. You appear to be the same. I'm not here for a character assessment, she said. No, he said. You're here to close a case. Yes. He looked at the folder again. He sat with something for a moment. She didn't name it, she let it be whatever it was, because some moments required the patience of not forcing them to a conclusion before they were ready. Then he picked up the folder. He didn't open it at the table. He held it. He looked at her. The formal determination will take 72 hours to process through the right channels, he said. In the meantime, no operational movement on the case. Confirmed, she said. The documentation in this folder goes no further. As long as the determination is made, she said. Yes. He nodded once. He stood up. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has made a calculation and is not entirely at peace with it and has decided to proceed anyway, which was, she thought, the expression of most of the significant decisions in most significant lives. Your father would have done this differently, he said. Not criticism. Something more complicated. My father is dead, she said. I'm doing it the way I know how. He held the folder against his chest. He nodded one more time. He walked back to the elevator. She sat in the lobby for 90 seconds after he disappeared, making sure her hands were steady before she stood up, making sure her legs had resolved the particular tremor that had been running through them since she'd sat down. Then she stood up, straightened her coat, and walked to the door. Outside, Marcus was leaning against the car with his arms crossed, and an expression that communicated his complete thoughts on the subject of being left in the car during an operation. 40 minutes, he said. I know, she said. Drive. She called Luca from the car. It's done, she said. A silence. Then, you're all right? Yes. What happened? She told him. All of it. Hargrove in the lobby, the folder, the terms. She heard him absorb it in the particular way he absorbed things, the quiet that meant processing and not absence. 72 hours, he said. Yes. The case is closed. When the determination comes through. And Hargrove, he'll hold to it, she said. He's a man who manages information. The folder gives him more reason to close this quietly than to push it forward. He knows that. You're certain. She thought about it. She looked out the window at the city moving past. I'm certain enough, she said, which is the most certain anyone gets. A pause. Come home, he said. She looked at the city. The particular density and indifference of it, the way it held everything and was moved by nothing, the way it had gone on doing exactly what it did, while 3 years of her life had been detonated and reconstructed and brought back to this point on this morning in this car. I'm on my way, she said. Adrian Mercer was arrested at his Westchester estate at 9:47 that morning. She wasn't there when it happened. She heard it from Marcus, who had a source in the county sheriff's department, and called her from the hallway outside Luca's office where she was sitting with coffee. She wasn't drinking, and the particular aftermath stillness of a body that has run at maximum capacity for too long and is beginning, cautiously, to stand down. Federal agents, Marcus said, 4 vehicles. He went quietly. She thought about Adrian going quietly. She thought about all the things that could be contained in a phrase like that. The specific deflation of a man who has run out of moves and knows it, who has arrived at the ground level of himself and found it has nothing to offer. She put the phone down. Luca came back into the office 20 minutes later. He had been on calls, the kind of calls that happened when a situation closes, the specific operational sequence of communicating to the right people that the ground had stabilized. He came in and looked at her and did the read he always did, the specific attentive scan of a man who needed to know she was intact before he could fully attend to anything else. She was intact. She was exhausted and intact. He sat down across from her. They were quiet together for a moment, which was something they could do, the particular companionable quiet of two people who had learned each other's silences well enough to live in them. "Reyes," she said. Luca was quiet for a moment. "He's out of the city," he said. "He'll stay out." "That's enough?" "For now," he said. "The exposure he created has been contained. If he surfaces and causes problems, the conversation changes." He said it flatly, without embellishment, and she heard the full spectrum of what it contained. Not cruelty, something older and sadder than cruelty, the specific cost of a relationship that had been genuine and had been used against itself. "I'm sorry," she said, "for what it cost you." He looked at her. "It cost the operation," he said. "Not me." "Luca," he held her gaze. A muscle moved in his jaw. "Yes," he said more quietly. "It cost me." She nodded. She didn't push further. Some things were allowed to be true without being processed into language. "Isabel," she said. "She found it," he said. "She brought it the right way. There are people who rise in a crisis." He said it with the specific respect of someone who has spent a long time identifying which people those are. "She's one of them." Vivian thought about Isabel putting the folder on the desk and sitting down across from her with the look of a woman who has made a decision she can't unmake. She thought about all the small acts of courage that don't look like courage, the ones that happen in office rooms over financial documents, the ones that require you to bring something forward when bringing it forward is the harder path. "And Selena," she said. "She can come back to the city," Luca said. "Adrian is in federal custody. The people he was working with are now focused entirely on their own exposure. She has no value as a target anymore." A pause. "She took a significant risk. She should know that's not forgotten." Vivian thought about Selena Marrow in that restaurant, thin and spent, putting an envelope on the table between them. "I'm sorry. For the beginning. For being in your house." She thought about the specific complexity of forgiving someone, the way it wasn't a single event, but a long and uneven process that required you to keep deciding it. She hadn't decided it fully yet. She thought she might, eventually. That was enough for now. The days that followed were quiet, in the way that the aftermath of a storm is quiet. The absence of a thing that had been constant long enough that its absence was itself a presence. She moved through the Deveraux building and the city and the ordinary machinery of days, and felt the specific recalibration of a body and a mind that had been operating in emergency mode, returning to something that was not emergency. It was not peace. She was precise about that. She didn't mistake the absence of crisis for peace, the way she had once mistaken the absence of conflict in the marriage for contentment. Peace was something different. Peace was something you built deliberately, knowing that you were building it and knowing what it cost. She was building it. The formal determination from Hargrove's office came through in 68 hours, 4 hours ahead of schedule, which she interpreted as a man being efficient about a thing he'd decided to do and not being interested in the theater of making her wait. The case against Luca Deveraux's operation was formally closed, internally, with a determination citing compromised evidentiary foundation. It would not appear in any public record. It would be a document that existed in a drawer somewhere, read by 3 people, acknowledged by none. She sat with the confirmation for a long time when it came. She thought about 3 years. She thought about Palermo and Sicily and the smoke and Luca's gloved hand extended toward her in a room with a single overhead light. She thought about the safe house and the evenings when she had first started to understand that the world contained different rules than the ones she'd been shown, and that knowing those rules was not a moral failure, but a form of survival. She thought about Rome and the civil ceremony and Enzo crying into a handkerchief. She thought about the limousine and the cameras and Adrian at the top of the staircase with his champagne glass tilting. She thought about the marble corridor floor and the 6 minutes. She understood now what she hadn't understood then. that those 6 minutes hadn't been a collapse. They had been the specific moment when something that had been wrong for a long time finally stopped pretending to be right. The floor of that corridor had been the actual ground, after a long time of living above it. Everything since had been building from there. 3 months later, the annual winter gala of the Deveraux Syndicate was held in the main hall of the Park Avenue building, which had been transformed for the evening into something that communicated, with appropriate understatement, that the organization was not merely surviving, but had arrived at a new and settled phase of its existence. Crystal chandeliers. Orchestral music at the register that fills a room without overwhelming conversation. The specific composition of people that meant something. Senators and CEOs and foreign attachés and the kind of attorneys who get paid to know things. Not a performance of power, the actual thing. Vivian stood at the top of the staircase and looked down at the room. She was wearing black. She had come to think of it not as a color choice but as a position statement, the specific visual language of a woman who had decided that the quiet registration of a presence was more effective than the announcement of one. The diamond necklace at her throat. Her hair arranged with the particular simplicity that required more effort than it appeared to require. Her hands still. Isabel appeared at her side. They had developed something in the weeks since the crisis. Not friendship exactly, something more useful and in its own way more durable. The specific alliance of two women who had been in the same room when it mattered and had each been adequate to the moment. "Hargrove's brother is downstairs," Isabel said quietly. "I saw." "He came to you," Isabel said. Not a question, reading the meaning. "He came to the event," Vivian said, "which is a message." "What does it say?" Vivian looked down at the senator moving through the room below, working it with the specific, practiced ease of a man who had spent a career making proximity look like relationship. "It says the family is recalibrating," she said. "It says Daniel told him enough for him to understand where the ground is now." "That's useful," Isabel said. "Yes," Vivian agreed. Isabel descended the staircase. Vivian stayed at the top a moment longer. She was doing what she did at the beginning of rooms, reading it before she entered it, taking the full measure of what was present and what was absent and what the space required of her. She thought about what Luca had told her in this building on their first night back in New York, about the room adjusting its understanding of where the ground was. She understood that differently now than she had then. The room didn't adjust around her because of Luca. It adjusted because of what she had become, which was something she had built herself, from materials she had acquired at significant cost. Over a period of time that had taken things from her, she would not recover and given her things she would not trade. She heard Luca behind her. She knew his footstep on marble, the particular weight and pace of it. He stood beside her at the top of the staircase. He looked at the room below and then at her face. "Ready?" he said. She looked at the room, at the people who had gathered there and the specific invisible architecture of what they represented and what the evening would require and what it would mean for the months that followed. She thought about this word ready. She had spent a long time waiting to feel ready for the things that were asked of her. And then she had spent a long time understanding that readiness wasn't a feeling, but a decision. And then she had spent a longer time understanding that the decision was one you made continuously. Not once, each morning and each room and each conversation. The same decision made again in a slightly different key. She was ready. "Yes," she said. He offered his hand. She took it. They descended the staircase together, into the light and the music and the room full of people who needed to understand where the ground was. And Vivian Castellane Deveraux, the woman who had once sat on a marble floor and counted to 6 minutes, who had been saved by a debt and rebuilt herself into something the debt could not contain, who had walked back into the city that had discarded her and made it answer for what it had done, walked into that room without hesitation, without performance, without anything except the full and settled weight of who she had become. The crowd parted, not because of the man beside her, because of her. She felt it in the specific shift of a room's attention, not the surface attention of cameras and curiosity, the actual attention, the kind that means people are making calculations, and the calculations are coming out a particular way. She had learned to feel the difference. The difference was everything. Luca leaned close enough that only she could hear. "Do you regret coming back?" he said. The same question he had asked in Sicily years ago in a different lifetime, when she had been a woman in a safe house learning to trust a man who had no reason to help her and helped her anyway. She looked out at the room. She thought about Adrian in federal custody, his empire being dismantled piece by piece in the way that empires without moral foundations eventually get dismantled, not by enemies, by the weight of their own construction. She thought about Reyes, somewhere outside the city, living in the specific diminished geography of a man who had traded the thing he was trusted with for a path that turned out to lead nowhere worth going. She thought about Selena Mero, who had made one right choice after a series of wrong ones and had been given enough room to begin again. She thought about Hargrove in a lobby, holding a folder against his chest, making the calculation that quiet versions of endings are better than loud ones. She thought about Marcus, who was somewhere in this building making sure nothing could go wrong, which was what he did and who he was and the specific unglamorous necessity of that. She thought about Isabel, downstairs, already working a room because work was what she loved. She thought about her father saying fair men deserved a chance. She thought about the floor. She thought about the 6 minutes. She thought about everything that had come after the 6 minutes, the entire long and difficult and costly architecture of becoming a person she recognized. And she looked at the room in front of her and felt the specific weight of it. Not lightness, not the clean, uncomplicated triumph of the story she might have told herself about this moment before she understood what the moment would actually cost. Just weight. The honest weight of a life fully lived, with all of its damage and its becoming, held in the body of a woman who had decided continuously to keep going. She smiled. "Not anymore," she said. The orchestra moved into the next piece. The room went on doing what rooms do. And Vivian walked forward into it, her hand in his, her head level, her eyes open. Not toward any ending, because endings were not the thing she was building anymore. Toward the next room. And the one after that. And all the rooms that came after, each one requiring the same decision made again, in her own name, on her own terms. The chandeliers threw light across the ceiling. The music played. The city moved outside the windows, indifferent and constant, and she moved with it.